Hi, thank you so much for joining. We're going to get started at the 5-minute mark, so 12:05, and we'll wait for Todd and Jody Boyman to run through. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Hey, sweets, comma. Thanks for taking the girls to breakfast, period. Ophelia is here now, period. I am starting my talk in a couple minutes, period. Just ask the girls not to come into my room when you bring them home.
One our matcha is $58. It's ecologically sound.
Hey, Claire.
Hi. Oh, I'm actually Adrienne. I'm the other co-president.
Adrienne, okay, cool.
Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
So cool.
How's it going so far?
It's going really well. There's a ton of people here. I'm
Yeah,
really
great.
excited for your portion of the event.
I'm excited.
I think we're gonna get started right
Great.
now.
It will be like, it'll be interview style, is that right?
Well, the first 25 minutes will be you presenting.
Okay.
I also have some questions prepared just for you. If
Got it.
there's extra time, and then the last 30 minutes will also be with Hungry Planet.
Okay.
And it's Todd and Jody Boyman, and they'll be talking a little bit about plant-based entrepreneurship as well.
Okay, so for the first 25 minutes, I'll give my story. I know that there's some highlight on the technology piece with in terms of plant food manufacturing, and then after that, we'll go into some questions. Is that kind of right?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Okay.
Awesome.
So everyone, we're going to get started on our next segment. This is plant-based meat entrepreneurship. I'm pleased to announce Jenny Goldfarb. She's the CEO of Unreal Delis. It's a plant-based deli meat company, and she's worked with Shark Tank and I believe Mark Cuban, and has done a bunch of awesome work with plant-based meats.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here. Am I good to get started, Adrienne?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being an awesome, brilliant UPenn student and for caring about this incredible, super compelling issue of veganism and plant-basedness and getting to the crux of what really is 75% of the world's problems if you look at it, from animal cruelty to earthly devastation to healthcare, both costs and implications. And so I'm so happy to also be a part of this tribe. I grew up eating the standard American diet, and about 6 years ago, I learned that acronym SAD, how true it really is. I had one friend of my husband who started posting some videos of what's happening on these animal farms. And one day I said, how bad could this possibly be? And I started watching, and my heart just shattered into a million pieces. And as soon as I started looking into, could I get organic meat? Could I get cage-free eggs? Could I get organic dairy? Any way that I turned to try and figure out some way to be able to still consume this stuff, it was just even more devastation, truly. And so after I felt heartbroken, I really felt hoodwinked into thinking that this was normal, healthy, humane, acceptable in the first place. And I really felt like I was sold a false bill of goods. And so I told my very meat and potatoes husband and my toddler kids at the time that mommy was going to figure out how to cook from the produce and grain sections. And I didn't have any amazing culinary background to begin with. So you can imagine what a challenge that was. So it's going back about 6 years. I'm buying every vegan cookbook I could find, and I'm figuring out how to cook, making meats out of nuts and dairy out of also nuts, and using all sorts of other just scrappy creative ways to put together increasingly delicious meals. But it was quite a painstaking process. But after a while, the food got good and better, and every now and then there was a meal that was so unbelievable you couldn't believe there wasn't meat and dairy in this thing. And I said, you know what, I'm so fired up because I'm not only eating to where I feel like my ethical standards are, but I'm also I've lost a few pounds and we're all sleeping better and everyone's skin is better. And how does not everyone know about this? And so I said to my family, I want to create a vegan food blog. Not that there aren't 2 million of those already, but I said, I want to put my own spin on it. And I want to show people how doable and delicious this could be. So we started making this video content each week, a new vlog, a new video blog post of a new kind of recipe that I could come up with. And it's called Count Your Colors. It's still on there, about 40 recipes. They're all very sweet and doable and delicious. But but it was interesting because the blog itself wasn't an overwhelming success. And so I like to share that as like my first bit of advice, which is sometimes you try something and it doesn't work, but it may lead you to something else. And so like keep following those passions and plugging away and like mining for gold, because you never know where it might steer you, even if the main thing you're going after isn't a win. So I'm making these video blogs, and just to emphasize what a failure it was, just to really like wrap your heads around it, I'd spend like 7 or 8 hours editing a video after I already did all the recipe research when we shot it. And then I'd put it up on this Facebook group and I'd get like 20 likes. And I'm like, I worked for 8 hours for 20 likes. Anyway, so I want you to know, from the collegiate perspective that trying things and them not working can sometimes be a blessing in disguise. So what wound up happening was I realized that there were so many delicious burgers on the market. Beyond had already well been out by then. Impossible was coming out. And there were so many ways to make veggies yummy on their own right. And you can eat that all day long and be a very happy camper. But what I realized I was longing for most of all, I come from New York, if you can't hear it in my voice. And I wanted a really good New York deli sandwich. And I didn't want to eat tofurkey or whatever was out there. It wasn't like, passing muster. So I decided to recreate a classic corned beef, almost like a corned beef pastrami hybrid. And I just wanted it for my own palate, for my family, and to put on my food blog. And what wound up happening was there was like a Hanukkah party at the time that I'd had, and I had these sandwiches out, and people, friends and family who otherwise thought I was taking my family on like a crazy hippie crusade, were coming up to me like, this is the best corned beef sandwich I ever had. I went back for thirds and I don't like any faux meats, and giving me all these like amazing compliments on this meat. And they said, you should make a food business out of this. And I tried to turn them down for the longest. And then ultimately they got the better of me. I started emailing some folks I knew in like the vegan world here in Los Angeles. And I said, do you know anyone that has a food business? I got in touch with a lovely couple that had a little business, and I met with them and I said, what do you think? I brought them sandwiches and they were like, it's yummy. What do you want to do with it? I said, I'd love to make it and try and sell it. And they said, well, we have a tiny commercial kitchen right here. You could rent for $25 an hour. So this is going back almost 3 years. I started making it myself. I would drop my 2 kids off at preschool. I was also pregnant at the time with my 3rd. I would go picking up the ingredients at my local store. I would bring my Vitamix and all the stuff out to this kitchen. I'd cook it all day. I'd clean the dishes. And in the days I wasn't doing that, I would drive around Los Angeles to try and sell it to the big old school delis that we have out here. New York has the famous Katz's Deli. We have Cantor's. There are a whole bunch of other like iconic New York style delis that are open all night and they've been around 100 years and that literally haven't put a new item on their menu in practically 100 years. So when I walked in and I was able to like share samples, and the deli owners legitimately were like, this is delicious. And we understand we're in Los Angeles, just like Philadelphia, like people are eating this way more and more. They quickly took it onto the menu. We were getting all these rapid reorders. And then I reached out to my local Whole Foods and I was like, 200 cold emails going in. Finally, someone said, all right, we'll try a sample. And they liked it to the point that they said, we're going to introduce you to our sandwich making partners. And we know you're not retail ready. I was still at the time, like wrapping it in like saran wrap. That's how not retail ready I was. But they brought us on with a pre-made sandwich into 58 of the Southern Pacific stores. So once I had the local delis and I had Whole Foods like under my belt, I said, I'm going for the gold. I'm reaching out for Shark Tank. So I sent in a very quick 30-second web application. That's like really all you need to get onto the show or to get considered to get onto the show. And I got a call a few weeks later from a casting director. And we spoke, and then they asked for tons of submissions. You thought it was hard to get into UPenn? Just wait, okay? I mean, like I'm talking like 5 or 6 50-page long handwritten applications, video applications. I mean, they practically needed like a blood sample, but not quite. And it was just very intense. Finally, I was on the show. So exciting. I'm there in front of the Sharks on the Sony studio lot here in Los Angeles. They're eating my sandwiches. I went onto that show with only $10,000 in revenues, which was like nothing even for that show. And I wound up coming out with a deal with Mark Cuban for more than double the cash I was asking for. It's like almost unheard of in Shark Tank world. But anyway, that was huge. Walked out with $250,000 for 20% of the business. And I had Mark Cuban as a partner. And so left that experience, like one of the most exhilarating, experiences of my life. And I wound up trying to get into food service, which is essentially like restaurants or stadiums or healthcare. Anywhere that you eat a meal outside your home is called food service. And so we were trying to get into all these different types of restaurants. And it was early 2020, and we had some very big deals on the table for some several hundred chain restaurants, and it looked like things were just about to explode when COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we realized that our restaurant partners were struggling. That big deal for that big nationwide expansion was totally off the table. And we needed to pivot into retail to make ourselves relevant, to meet the customers where they were, and to survive as a business. So we created our first retail packaging. I'll hold up. This is our Unreal corned beef. This is we realized also we needed to create more items in order to stay relevant and keep some real shelf space. So we created Unreal roasted turkey, and Unreal steak slices is our most recent launch, our most recent product. And so what's so special about these items, I mean, everyone will say it's like the taste and the texture is like nothing like you'll find out there and extremely realistic, but also our products are made with whole vegetables. We didn't want to go for as much as like the super sciencey route and doing things like kind of more like tech lab based. We wanted to keep things more natural. And so we use protein rich grains like high protein wheat and chickpea flour. And then each of our meats have their own signature vegetables in them. Our corned beef has beets, chickpeas, tomatoes. Our turkey has white beans, onions, and celery. And our steak slices have lentils and mushrooms. So there are like whole vegetables going into these. And our goal in 2021 was to get into 1,200 grocery locations, to get 100 new stores a month, essentially, to take us on. And I can proudly say that at the end of this year, we'll be in 2,500 stores, which just completely blows my mind because I literally started this business barefoot and pregnant in my home kitchen, not working, not doing anything. So it's an incredible accomplishment, but it, you know, the ecstasy and the agony of running a business all the time. It's extremely, you know, high stress, high powered, high stakes, literally steak slices, high stakes. And we're working to get into all sorts of different, you know, restaurants and healthcare. And, you know, we just started a ghost kitchen project. If you guys are familiar with this, it's where essentially there are all these like new restaurants that now exist on apps because existing restaurants will sometimes take in another restaurant concept into their kitchen. And so we've been able to sell the Unreal Deli Ghost Kitchen, a full line of vegan subs that are now, we have 10 locations in New York, and we're coming to a lot of other cities soon. I hope Philadelphia will be soon on the list. And so it's a tremendous pleasure to get to work every day doing something that I believe so much about. As far as some of the other like tech advancements coming into the plant-based space, you know, there's a lot going on now with fermentation. I'm seeing a lot of that with regard to dairy and some other kinds of plant-based products coming from that. And then there's like the true cell-based meat. And I must tell you that, you know, I came into this to shut down slaughterhouses. And so I'm like thrilled to see all of it coming to life. I know that there's a place for plant-based and that there always will be. People will always want to get some veggies in their meat, even once we are making these cell-based products. And so I see what's happening before my eyes. And I truly believe we need to feed the entire world on this kinds of food. So I want to see all the brands coming forth, and I want to speak at all the different kinds of talks that I can give to inspire people to create something and to know that you can make something in your home kitchen and that it can get as big as, you know, Shark Tank and thousands of locations and beyond. My best advice for getting started with something like this is to make it as best you can, to sample it around to your friends and family and really beg for honest feedback and be willing to make adjustments. And then try and sell your closest local store. I have a girlfriend who's working on this cotija cheese. And I said to her, don't reach out to Chipotle, go to your local little Mexican cantina and see if you can get them to take it on for their tacos. And then once you've got that, you tell the next guy, they're doing it. Everyone loves it there. Now we're going here. And so, anyway, that might seem obvious, but that's, you know, just starting small and then growing is definitely the path to getting things out there and to creating, you know, once you get that first customer, that's really like more important than even the biggest ones. I remember when I first sold Cantor's Deli, I sold a couple of other delis before and they each ordered like 12 pounds and 15 pounds. And then when I sold Cantor's, which is like kind of like the Katz's, it's like the most iconic deli here in LA, they said, I want to order 50 pounds. I remember I got in my car and I was crying tears of joy that 50 pounds. And now we get orders for 5,000 pounds. And I'm like, okay, it doesn't even like, you know, register barely because we expected at this point, but little by little, we grew this baby. We now have 10 people in the core company. We also have a manufacturing plant here in LA, and we're opening a manufacturing plant in in Atlanta next year. I'm just going to open the door for my dog. I'm sure you guys understand. Right this way. Sorry, guys. Got to take care of those animals. Yeah, and I have 3 little daughters, 3 girls that that now see like all this cool stuff that mommy can do, being a boss and all of this. So it's really such a blessing, and it's hard work, but it's amazing work. And yeah, I'm wide open to any questions. I want to be a resource. I want to encourage people to eat this way, to cook this way, to make products to sell into the marketplace this way. I want to eat them all. And I thank you guys for being on the forefront of caring about what matters in this world, and taking care of our most vulnerable in the way that you eat and the things that you're interested in. On a Sunday afternoon, you could be like at a frat party and you're here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Does anyone have any questions for Jenny so far? I'll get started. So I'm from New York, and I know very well the sanctity of New York deli institutions. How did you sort of adapt your products for like this market of like New Yorkers who are very like passionate about their deli meats, maybe in comparison to markets like in California that are more open or more used to vegan meat?
Totally. So I feel like this like kind of New York and California thing blended very nicely for me in this way. I come from New York, but not only that, my great grandfather immigrated from Romania, escaping persecution, and wound up in the Lower East Side, working his first job as a 13-year-old without his parents coming with him as a dishwasher in his first deli, and then later came to own and operate many New York City delis and cafeterias. So I like to think that like real authentic deli is like deep in my bloodline. And so I ate a ton of deli as a kid. I grew up actually mostly, although born in New York, mostly in South Florida. And we had a couple local delis, and that was like almost weekly was I having like a pastrami sandwich at one of these delis. And so I really knew I had like the flavor profile still like mapped somewhere in the back of my mind. And so I knew what I was going for when I set out to make it. And I looked up a lot of the classic brines and spices that were used in making a corned beef, because you just throw like regular meat into these brines to make it corned beef. And so I knew the structure of a lot of faux meats, some, using like that wheat protein, some soy, some tofu. I stuck with wheat protein and chickpea flour as like kind of like my base. And then I basically Googled all of these spices. And I remember the first time I made it, I texted my father and husband, and I said, this is the most delicious thing I ever ate. And then of course it only got better, and we found ingredients that we could scale in production. And that's a whole, bag of worms or whatever vegan analogy there is for that to be able to grow, but yeah, so essentially like using some good Google skills plus knowing how to make some faux meats from being like so deeply investigating of my of those cookbooks was able to help make this beautiful marriage.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. I really enjoyed the presentation. Really resonated with a lot of the things you said. And I'm also an avid fan of Shark Tank. So I have seen your show.
Yeah.
So one of my questions was, how did your experience as a plant-based entrepreneur in the niche sector of the food industry influence your perspectives of business operations and strategic marketing?
Okay. So as far as I really feel like this is the moment now where like the world is waking up to what's going on, and that it's now lending itself to very easy kind of marketing and operations. And I say that, just, and don't take that, with too much weight, but essentially, there's this famous Paul McCartney quote that says, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian. I'm sure he really means vegan, but that is what he said. And so slaughterhouses don't have glass walls, but what does YouTube? And who's watching? All of us. We get it. We're seeing it. We know. And the world is waking up, if it's from an environmental or health or animal or earthly. I mean, the truth is seeping in. And so as that truth seeps in, it means that like our Instagram followers are super engaged because they want to vote with their dollar and be on the right side of history and be doing the right thing for the world and for themselves. And so I feel like as far as from a marketing side, we have just like so much support because we're on the right side of history, and people know that. And even if they don't totally know it yet, they realize there's something going on. There's something trendy happening here. I was on the phone recently with Albertsons in Iowa, and they said to me, you know, gluten-free took like 10 years to get from the coastal cities into us in Iowa, but this whole vegan thing is happening like light speed, because it's really like a wake-up call. And it's like a really great, wild thing to feel like, you know, we were like almost indoctrinated to believe this was normal, healthy, and humane, and then to like wake up and find another way. So it's much bigger than any like gluten-free or any other kind of fad. And then you asked as far as manufacturing, I'll tell you that in those earliest days when I was like barefoot and pregnant, I was like calling up places like, hey, I made this amazing thing. Would you want to make it for me? And it was like, hang up, hang up, hang up. But now that like I made it myself, I got those first customers. Now when you can make calls and be like, I have orders of this and this and this a month, it's like right this way, rolling out the red carpet. So, you know, once you kind of take the ball down the field a few yards, you know, then you can, you know, the whole company's valuation obviously grows, and you're able to like open so many more doors because of that. I hope that answered your question. Okay.
Yeah, awesome. And could you speak a little bit about creating your own company and being a female entrepreneur and sort of blazing the way for other female entrepreneurs in this space?
Yes, I can. I feel like this is the time. This is our time. We got this. I'll tell you like just like a couple of total benefits is grocery stores are very famous for charging slotting fees. It's almost like putting down first last security on like an apartment to like actually get that shelf space. They literally want to just charge you sometimes tens of thousands, even more possibly of dollars to be able to just get your product in. And they're not guaranteeing even one sale of it. And so a lot of chains such as Kroger and like huge ones, they're like, oh yeah, if you're a woman or any kind of minority, there's like no slotting fees. So it's like, again, rolling out the red carpet. I honestly feel like it's more of a benefit than anything else. You know, we're in this industry where folks are already recognizing that some oppression has taken place. And I certainly don't want to get political in the statement. It's just to say that like what we've done to these animals. And so being a woman in this space, I feel like is like double downing on like, we're going to take this whole model and like kind of throw it on its head. And we're running things now a little bit, you know, not any diss to the guys, but that there's, I just see like all doors open to being a female entrepreneur today, especially in this space.
Yeah, awesome. So our next question is, what was your experience like working, going on Shark Tank and then also working with Mark Cuban afterwards?
Totally. So it was the most exhilarating experience of my life. I will say one thing that I realize now that totally helped me get on the show, or at least helped the producers realize that there was like a great segment here. In the earliest days of the business, and this was of course way pre-COVID, I do think something like this could happen. Maybe these days I took a little platter to some open mall area and I was like, hey, will you taste the bite? We taste the bite. And people tasted, and my husband was just on the iPhone, and they were like, wow, it's so good. And I was like, there's no meat in that. And they were like, what? And everyone's mind were blown. So it was this adorable little thing where I was like, you know, shocking people into there not being meat in that, and them acknowledging straight up how delicious it was. And we edited that together and put it up on the website. So that was like the first thing that my super rudimentary unrealdeli.com website had on it. And actually it started off where I was like, I'm Mrs. Goldfarb and I come from 100 years of New York deli history. And then it went into that. So I'm just giving you guys the template for if you're making a food business and you want to get on Shark Tank, this is how the video should go. And so we had that up on the website and I didn't even realize, but when the casting director, you know, after I made that little submission, checked out our site and they clicked on it, they were like, that's our segment right there. Like there's nothing else you even have to write, right? There's just got all the deli history. People love it. End of story. So that was a huge help to like getting on the show, or at least getting the producers to like take me seriously. And then, yeah, this like super stringent application process. And then the next thing, you're on that show. I did a lot of meditation before, you know, I never really watched the show before. So I spent like weeks like studying it nonstop. And I kind of knew like all the different kinds of questions and all the different ways they might possibly ask us to, you know, ask for me to, you know, work the financial deal. I didn't know any of that. And I learned all that on the job. And honestly, when I got on the show, my takeaway was sometimes the biggest doors with the heaviest locks can come flying wide open like nothing if you're in the right headspace. I'm obviously Jewish. My name is Goldfarb. I can't escape that. And so I'll just share one little piece of like kind of advice with all of this. You may have heard the term mazel tov. So mazel actually comes from an acrostic. So the M stands for makom, which means place, and the Z, the Zion, stands for zman, which means time. So most people say you're in the right place at the right time, so it all worked out. But in the word mazel, there's also an L, the lamed, which means la'asot, which means to do, because it's not enough to be in the right place at the right time and just be idly there. You have to be doing the thing, chipping away at it, doing the work. And so I feel like I had real mazel tov on that show because I was so invested in doing the right thing, and that just came across. And so it was really unbelievable to me that I got this like incredible offer from more than double the cash I was asking for. And as far as working with Mark, right after the show, you're on the Sony studio lot, and the head of council of whomever the shark is comes to your trailer and shakes your hand, and you exchange business cards. And so he said to me, you need to write to Mark once a week and give him like the updates of kind of what's going on in the business. So I started doing so. What he didn't tell me was you only need to do this during due diligence, meaning like the couple of months it takes to figure out if you've said everything honestly on the show and if you're a worthy investment and all this. So I kept doing it and doing it and doing it. This has been 2 years now. I write him every Friday, even if it's like a Christmas, I send him an email. And it's really paid off because he actually just made a new investment in Unreal Deli a couple of months ago because we're so caught up and kept up with each other. He always writes me back. I write him something this long. He writes me like a sentence and a half, but it's pretty targeted, that sentence and a half, and I wouldn't trade that for the world. He also has a team underneath him out in Dallas. So he's got like a biz dev guy and a sales and marketing person and an accounting person. And I have access to all of them and work with them fairly regularly. So that's how it is working with Mark. I'd say a real delight overall.
Thank you so much for sharing, Jenny. So now we're going to get into the segment with Todd and Jody Boyman from Hungry Planet. Thank you so much for being here. If you two would like to introduce yourselves.
Great. And hi, Jenny. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Todd.
Hi, Jenny.
Hi,
Jenny,
Jody.
Are you based in LA? Is that your home court?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, fantastic. Good. Jody's up in Santa Barbara, so you guys are not too far away from each other. Yeah.
Love it.
Yep.
Excellent.
Yeah, we would love, Ms. Goldberg, we would love to, if you could stay too, if you have the time, but if not, like, thank you so much for your presentation and for answering our questions. And Mr. and Mrs. Boyman, we would love to hear from you now.
Thank you all.
Great. So are we doing a Q&A, or is this live now, or what's the approach to this?
Yeah, this is live now. If you two could just like sort of introduce your story for like a couple of minutes, like 3 minutes maybe, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Fantastic. Great. And how many students are participating in this?
Like 20 students in the room right now.
Fantastic. All right. Wonderful. Great. Well, nice to meet you all and to be with you all. My name is Todd Boyman. Jody, my sister. Together we co-founded Hungry Planet. And what we make are delicious, nutritious, plant-based meats. And we're the only company on the planet actually to do 9 different protein types. So, a lot of people focus, for example, just on beef and burgers or on chicken nuggets. But we sent out on a vision on over 18 years ago to create every type of animal protein directly out of plants. So we do beef, we do chicken, we do pork, we do crab, we do lamb, we do turkey, we do chorizo sausage, breakfast sausage, Italian sausage. And the reason we started off with that vision was that the mission of our company is to bend the curve on personal and planetary health. And when you look at animal protein globally, right, the most consumed animals on the planet are, first of all, pork, and then chicken, and then beef, and then lamb, turkey, and all these others. So if you really want to make a difference and bend the curve on personal and planetary health, which is our mission, you really had to look at this globally. So that's what we set out to do. It's been a long road. We started off by self-funding this business with some like-minded individuals over 18 years ago. And we had the benefit that we kind of thought about solving this problem way before others were thinking that you'd even want to solve this problem. And until really about 3 years ago, we would still be talking with people in the grocery industry and people in the food service industry. They kind of look at us quizzically like, well, what are you doing and who would be interested in that? And why do you want to do this? But Jody, who's based up in Santa Barbara, unbelievably tenacious. She's been a plant-based vegan eater since her grade school days, so 40 plus years. Took me 10 years after that to catch up, so I've been eating plant-based for about 30 years. So it's really been part of our lifestyle and our DNA for a long time. And it's wonderful to see how the market now has come along. And in the past 3 to 4 years, we no longer get the question of plant-based meats. Wait, those are animals that you were serving plants to? I mean, really, until 4 years ago, that's what we would get more often than not. And now we don't have that discussion anymore. It's like, oh, plant-based meats, what makes you different? Jody, do you want to share a little bit maybe about kind of you're working with customers all the time about how we're different specifically when grocers and others are evaluating the value proposition of what we've put together here at Hungry Planet?
Yeah, so I am the older sister, just to set the record straight. And we are very clear on our packets. We have our value prop right there. So you can now find all of our food at Sprouts, 362 locations and lots of Albertsons, Safeway locations, new ones coming online all the time. But it's really important for us so that when you pick up one of our packets of food, you can see immediately what you're getting, how much protein, how much less fat. So we have no saturated fat in any of our meats, and our meats tend to have about half the calories, fraction of the overall fat, lower sodium, really high in protein and fiber. So they're just delicious and nutritious meats that happen to be made from plants. And, we've engineered them so that they taste exactly like conventional meat. So, because our target is not vegans and vegetarians, of which I've been for 45 years, a plant-based eater, but it is for everybody else on the planet, 95% of people of humanity that eat meat, and some of them eat it quite regularly. So we're there for that easy swap, and our ground meats are really easy to use as a one-to-one swap in any recipe that you grew up with, your mom's favorite lasagna or your grandmother's beef bourguignon or whatever it is. You just take Hungry Planet, you swap it in, one thing, you make the dish, you serve it, and there's room for everybody around the table. Everybody feels satisfied, especially with the holidays coming up. This is a big deal because there's a lot of tension in families where there's vegans, vegetarians, omnivores, flexitarians, hardcore carnivores. And our meat is there to satisfy everybody. And so that just diminishes any of that tension.
Yeah, and maybe just to give you guys 2 examples maybe of how realistic this food is, because there are a lot of plant-based meats out there that quite frankly aren't all that good. Now Jenny's are superb, so hers come highly recommended, but there are a lot of them out there that if you eat, I mean, truly they don't deliver on the promise of what they say they do, right? So there's a lot of hype in this space, and it's a real disservice to consumers who are hearing about this, and then they go taste it and they're like, yeah, that was just a real disappointment, right? It either didn't taste like what it's supposed to taste like, or it doesn't digest well, or the nutritionals aren't very good. Because if you're plant-based, right, the assumption is that this should be better for you than other things. And so you have kind of this halo effect, but a lot of people really take advantage of that and aren't delivering things that are better. 2 really interesting stories about our journey. In 2016, which seems like a long, long time ago, we all this plant-based meat industry, there was a lot of buzz that was starting to happen, particularly in Silicon Valley, that was putting tens of millions and hundreds of millions and ultimately billions into some companies in this space. And one of the top executives at Apple Computers started to read some of these headlines about what was coming. And he was having an annual offsite for 16 top executives at Apple. And he wanted to see whether or not he could find a company that was actually doing what these other companies were talking about and feed it to the other top executives there. And so they did their research. We really didn't even have a website up that was talking in depth about what we were doing, but the event planner found us and said, would you guys be interested in coming to San Francisco and preparing a full course meal with 4 or 5 of your different meats for these 16 top executives? And we're like, yep, we're on it. Because 16 years, or back in 2016, again, there weren't a whole lot of people who understood what this was about. Our chef went up there to San Francisco, put together a multi-course meal. All it was vegan, and the only person who knew was the sponsoring executive, right? So none of the others knew. And so they were eating chicken and lamb and beef and crab. And at the end, the executive said, well, how all did you all like this dinner? And, yeah, fantastic. They brought the chef out and thank you for that dinner. And then the sponsoring executive said, well, hold on, chef, stay here. Everybody, you've just eaten the future of food. Everything that you had, including the crab, the beef, the lamb, the chicken, et cetera, was plant-based, right? Standing ovation because they had no idea. And we've done that to two of the largest meat companies on the planet, punked them. 100 of the top executives and their significant others at their annual banquet had no idea until they'd all consumed the food. Now you can imagine how that went down, right? Dead silence when it was announced, right? 200 pairs of eyes are looking like, what's going on? And then again, standing ovation of well played. I mean, they had no idea. And we have a team right now in the Middle East that I'm sure the people in the Middle East aren't going to be watching this, but the same thing is going to happen tonight in the Middle East to a really prestigious group over there as well. So it's a lot of fun when you get it right and you get the food so it's absolutely delicious and you can deliver on that promise. It's absolutely fantastic when you can get those kind of reactions.
Yeah, thank you so much. So to start off the questions, to all of the panelists, do you notice pushback or hesitancy from giants in the food tech industry, specifically those from non-plant-based business sites?
So from the food industry or the food tech industry, because there's probably a different answer depending on the intention of that question.
Well, if you could elaborate on both.
Yeah, okay. So look, the big food companies, right? The food industry in general seems to aggregate up because you need efficiencies of scale to drive the costs down. And I think it's less pushback from them and it's more concern because these big companies are not very nimble. They don't move really rapidly and they don't innovate terribly well. So they're sitting there looking at all these insurgent brands and all these new ideas coming to market, trying to figure out, well, how do we do that? If you spend any time searching plant-based meats and you figure out who's really making a difference, they aren't the meat companies, they're tied to the big food companies, right? Because they don't get it. The people who are working on those projects are working on them because somebody said, hey, somebody in this room, hey, you go figure out how to do plant-based meats. And the person's like, me? Well, why would I? Okay, I'll do whatever you want me to do, right? So there isn't the passion, there isn't the belief in what this category is about that Jody brings, that Jenny brings, that I bring to this, right? So there's a degree of authenticity and energy to it. On the food tech side, a lot of those companies are, by definition, really innovative. And there's some phenomenal things that are going on in that area. They're raising tens of millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to come up with interesting underlying technologies that can power plant-based meats. But there are a lot of questions really about which of those technologies are going to be useful, which ones are consumers going to want, which ones scales. So in that case, it's not pushback that we get from them, but we regularly are courted by those players saying, hey, our investors have put all of this money into us. Would you please, please, please use our ingredients because we need to tell our investors we've got customers. And I think Jody and I are kind of like, well, we're not going to do it just to please your investors. We need to make sure that we're delivering on our brand promise. So, yeah.
Does anyone in the audience have any questions so far? Okay. So Jenny sort of touched on this earlier, but with other products emerging like lab-grown meat, what directions do you see the future of plant-based meats going into? And we just had Dr. Kaplan and New Harvest on earlier, and they were talking about maybe like a blend of plant-based and cell-based meats. Do any of you see that as a future for plant-based meats?
I definitely see a hybrid. I think there's always going to be a demand for plant-based products, but I also see this whole cell-based move literally shutting down slaughterhouses. So that's what I'm excited about. But we're also going to have to be able to compete on pricing. You know, even today, I get a lot of pushback like, how is yours $1 more than regular meat? And I'm like, guys, government subsidies. Doesn't everyone know that? And not everyone knows that. And so you're going to take a baby cow and feed it all these meals and drinks and this and that, and slaughter it and all these things. And that's like, my beets are growing in the garden over here. Like, what's the problem? It's these government subsidies. And so hopefully upcoming administrations will start to fund products like ours to get out there and pull some funding away from what's been going on. But it definitely seems like the cell-based meat, even though it costs like $10,000 for a meatball today, soon they will actually bring the price down below regular meat. And so that's going to be a huge game changer. And so I definitely see that the plant-based products will stay on, and that the cell-based meat will also not only stay on, but tremendously prevail and hopefully shut all of those slaughterhouses down.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how all that plays out, right?
Yeah.
We've had our fair share of tasting some of these items. The science is interesting. It's very complex to create a cell-based piece of meat. And I think really the question comes down to what's the problem you're trying to solve. And if what you're trying to do is to lessen the pressure on the environment and to regenerate the planet and heal our bodies, there's a question of, well, can cellular meat do that more effectively than plant-based can? And I think what we're finding with what the meats that Jody and I are developing is that already, if you can punk some of the largest meat companies on the planet and they can't tell, the question is what market is really going to be there for the cellular products at the point they come out there? Because most meat isn't consumed just as a steak. It's processed, it's deli meat, or it's hamburgers, or it's chicken nuggets. And in that case, properly done, we're already at the point where it's essentially indistinguishable. So ultimately the market will cast its votes and trying to figure out the signal from the noise of what's real and what's hype. There's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, and so one of our last questions is, what advice would you give aspiring entrepreneurs interested in entering the vegan food and technology space?
Jody?
Well, you know, I was just chatting with a young person recently who was doing a senior thesis, and she was asking me a lot of these questions. And, you know, I think it's really important to define the problem that you want to solve and to really examine the space as carefully as you can. And it's quickly growing. I mean, we were one of the original players. As Todd said, we've sort of been at this self-funded for about 18 years. And you know, we took in $25 million of investment recently, and there's more to come. So you really want to define the problem that you want to solve. And for younger people, that tends to be around making the world habitable for future generations. And, you know, I think this conference in Glasgow, Scotland is a perfect example of the need for us globally to come together and figure out solutions. And it's absolutely crazy to me that they're serving, you know, beef and chicken and other foods on the menu at this conference that have terrible CO2 emissions. You know, I mean, Hungry Planet cuts down 90% of CO2 emissions by eating our food, 90% of the water we save, and about 75% of the land. So, you know, if that is something that you're going for, which I think is a really wonderful thing. I've got 2 kids, Todd has 2 kids. You know, it's in our interest that they inherit a habitable planet. And so we really do believe in our mission, which is to bend the curve on human and planetary health. And that's where we focused our time and energy. But there are so many young people that I'm talking to that really kind of believe in that same thing. And there's so many different ways to go about addressing these existential issues that we have before us. But we need everybody. We need all hands on deck. So, to anybody that's sitting at the edge of their seat and me, please step forward and ask those of us who've been doing it for a while for guidance or help or whatever, but we need you. And we need your solutions to some of these overwhelming problems right now.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And on regards to what you just mentioned, would you guys mind actually dropping your emails for any students who are interested in contacting you for further questions? And one last round. Does anyone in the audience have any questions as well?
Can everyone speak a little to their current production process?
So the question is, can everyone speak to their current production process?
Sure. Until a couple of years ago, all of our foods were handmade. We had a small pilot production facility in St. Louis where we've headquartered the business, and they were all handmade. Obviously, that doesn't scale. So we now work with co-manufacturers around the country. We've got a half dozen or so co-manufacturers. And to protect our intellectual property, we do our blends in a blending facility, and then we ship those blends out to our co-manufacturers, who then take that through the final step of cooking it or preparing it. So not only are we the only company in the industry to have 9 different meat types, we're the only ones out there to do everything from ground chubs, say 5-pound chubs for food service, to retail chubs, to raw formed, to cook. So we have grilled, fried, roasted products, and then we also have ready to eat meals. So that production supply chain is really complicated. Can't walk you through all the details of all that, but it's very complicated. In order to make sure that we can scale and support our clients, we're now over 2,000 different points of distribution in retail. You've got to have both geographic redundancy as well as product redundancy. An earthquake hits or a tornado hits or whatever. So you've really got to think that through very, very carefully. So that's how we do our production. I don't know how Jenny does hers.
That was great, Todd. Yeah, similarly, mixing spices and keeping that IP elsewhere and then bringing that into co-packing. I remember when I first got going, I thought, well, I want to find like a deli meat co-packer. And I was calling all these deli meat co-packers, and they really didn't want to hear from me because they didn't want to think they were doing anything wrong. And so they were quick to hang up the phone on me. And then it came to me that actually the way our product is made is really we're combining wet and dry ingredients and we're baking them. So that could happen at any bakery facility. And I wound up finding initially a 15,000 square foot bakery place that would make it for us. And now we're actually moving into a 25,000 square foot facility here in the LA area and soon to be next year in Atlanta. So, but yeah, the same kind of idea as far as, keeping that IP elsewhere and bringing it in and having different points of manufacturing to be able to, of course, for any like natural disasters or strikes or anything like that. But even nowadays we're seeing just with freight fees, it's like just impossible. We just got an account with Publix and it's very exciting, but just having to ship the stuff from LA to Florida is like, we're barely going to pull any profit off of that deal until we can start manufacturing on the East Coast. So it's a constant struggle and trying to fit, the pegs into the right holes, but it's an exciting one.
Yeah, and in terms of connecting with us, we're all on LinkedIn. There's
Same
only
here.
one Jody, there's only one Todd, and there's probably only one Jenny. So I'd recommend that if you guys want to connect with us on LinkedIn. That's probably the easiest way for all 3 of us, speaking at least for Jody and me.
And our social media channels, which are all at Hungry Planet Foods. So if you follow us on LinkedIn, you can connect with us there. But yeah, on Facebook and Instagram, and then LinkedIn is the best place to connect with us personally.
Awesome.
Not
Yeah,
TikTok
we're
or anything yet. Maybe Jenny is. Jenny, are you on TikTok?
I'm on it, watching it, but I'm not yet participating. But certainly our Instagram is going strong at Unreal Deli. And I was also going to mention that, we're sold in a lot of places in Philadelphia, but V-Mark's the shop right there, practically on campus there at UPenn. We have all 3 of our meats. So I don't know if you guys want to mention where locally you guys are in Philly, but that's where you can find us.
So yeah, just go on our website to the Find Us tab, and we've got thousands of locations where you can find us, both to eat in restaurants, but also to purchase us on shelf. And we're also available broadly in e-commerce, so you can get us on Costco.com and Amazon. You can also order directly from our website on our store there. So we're readily available, you know, on the East Coast, up and down, but we're adding every day. So just go to our Find Us tab on our website, Hungry Planet Foods, and it'll give you the up-to-date information.
Thank you so much for sharing. I believe we have one last question.
Hey, my name's Matt. I don't know if you can hear now. When you were talking about before with government subsidies and the pricing increases as is, are you seeing further threats with the supply chain availability of products and ingredients around the time of COVID and things like that we're seeing on the restaurant side as well? Can that further threaten the pricing that you have on your products, or are you currently seeing it?
I'm not sure.
Heard some of it, but not all. Go ahead.
With regards to like the government subsidies and then the supply chain shortages, if you are, as retailers, are seeing issues with supply and threats to your market.
Can that further threaten pricing coming to retailers and restaurants right now?
Can that further threaten pricing to retailers and restaurants?
Yeah, well, it can, and it is. We've gone and hired someone on our R&D staff whose like sole job is to be dealing with the raw materials, ensuring that one time we order from this guy and then we toggle back to that guy to make sure no one runs out. We always have a steady stream. It's been like one way that we've kind of been able to assure our backup. But yes, it is an ongoing threat. Just last week, I saw that the price of wheat is going up just, you know, ubiquitously, and we're, you know, we use high protein wheat in a lot of our meats. And so I'm setting up an in-person meeting with our, you know, high protein wheat distributor over the next couple of weeks, because I realize how important these relationships are to be able to maintain. But even just the cost of freight, you know, to be able to say, even if the wheat is grown and everything works fine, to know that it could cost double just to bring it in, you know, so many things, you know, you realize that, you know, are kind of up in the air, when you have to sort of hope that, like, God willing, everything goes smoothly. And thankfully it has to this point, but it's an uncertain world. And so there are definitely, you know, things out there out of your immediate control.
Yeah, and what's interesting on that is that, you know, these price issues that go to the commodities that we all use in our ingredients, the difference between that and the policy issues that Jenny had spoken about previously is that everybody in the market has to go buy these ingredients. So if the prices go up or they become more scarce, it impacts all of us equally in terms of our ability to execute and the price pressures. The policy issues do not impact all of us equally, right? So those of you who are thinking about an interest in policy and impacting policy, that's a huge lever for change, right? I mean, the reason that Tesla exists today is because of government policy. We in the plant-based meat world do not exist today because of government policy. We exist of it in spite of government policy, right? So at the minute that government policy can start to change, and it's a long, arduous process, as anyone who follows, you know, American politics in particular sees, but the minute you can start changing those barriers that are embedded into the structure that are unfairly tilted against us, that makes a huge difference. We're all competing out there for ingredients, but when the government is offering subsidies to some industries and not others, or in the school lunch program is subsidizing meat and cheese and dairy, but doesn't have any subsidies to the types of products that Jenny and I make, that's a huge unfair disadvantage, right? So that's you know, a big difference. Policy is something that absolutely needs to be shaped, and there's some organizations that are working on that. And then there's just buying ingredients and operating your business that, you know, go up and down. But at least that's a fair playing field in that we're all competing on the same basis.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. I think that's all the questions we have for you. But yeah, thank you all for making the time to come here today. I personally learned so much, and I think everyone really enjoyed it.
Pleasure to be with you. I look forward to connecting with you all on LinkedIn. Have a wonderful Sunday.
Thank you all so much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.
Hi, Isaiah. We're gonna start at the 5 minute mark, so at 1:05. Just want to make sure, is your video and audio working?
Yeah, sorry about that, Claire. Can you hear me and see me fine? Sorry about that.
Yes, okay, I think I can hear you right now. We're not set up on the
Yeah,
presentation
I have
screen
to
yet.
leave.
And then do you have
exactly 30
screen
minutes.
sharing access?
Oh, yes, I do have it.
I'm gonna have to leave soon, but you can just use this until like whenever. Like,
Great, thank you.
yeah, just like let me know when you're done, and I'll pick it up whenever.
Yeah. Okay. So right now people are grabbing like vegan ice cream, burgers and such. So we'll start at the 12:05 mark, or not 12:05, 1:05 mark.
Yeah, that sounds great. I just wanted to say that I do have something to go to exactly at the 30 mark. So if it's a little, I'll try my best to be simplified for the presentation as possible. Just so, yeah, if that's okay.
I muted it. Yeah, perfect.
Okay. How um, animal rights movements and the environmental movement, how do they really intertwine in these movements, as you see that the global movement is increasing and people have a lot of questions about how these are intersections and how we can really become better stewards and advocates for this planet. To kind of get everyone started, I am the creator of Career Brown Vegan. I'm deeply passionate about education and the environment. I focus like a lot on environmental issues, really centered through an environmental justice lens, and I'm really been vegan for almost 3 years now. Actually, I accomplished my three-year anniversary just a few weeks ago. I kind of grew an interest to learn about environmental justice because of experiencing environmental racism, such as polluted air and growing up low income. So for me, I kind of got invested into doing this work at a young age and got my degree in environmental science back in Berkeley. And so that was a really tough time for me during education. And I really focused today on just creating local, equitable forms of environmental education for people, organizations, and institutions. To kind of get started, like how do you define veganism? I think it's really important to note that although the institution definition of veganism has existed since the 1940s, I believe, 1950s, like I think it's super important to acknowledge that a lot of cultures, especially Black and Indigenous people of color, have always had rich plant-based food systems a lot and really practice different forms of veganism. And so for me, when I look into veganism, how I define it, I look into really advocating for the total liberation of non-human animals and humans. So specifically what I really focus into is the liberation for animals in industrialized systems that are constantly being murdered and being oppressed, but also into the humans that are also having to really pick our food and also work in these extreme environmental conditions that are extremely horrific, and really looking into the global food supply chain to recognize and to reckon that institutionally this entity, whether you're looking into the agrochemical or the industrial agriculture, industrial aquaculture, has enormous economic GDP growth to a lot of global north countries. And this really, for me, is seeking to decentralize these systems into localized systems. And hopefully, the way I would define it is one that is free from the oppression of humans and animals, right? But although it varies by individual and by people, I really try to present this more holistic and interconnected lens with veganism. So to kind of get started, if those who don't know that much about environmental justice and what's that have to do with veganism, please stay tuned. Environmental justice is essentially a concept that's connected to social justice, that looks into the distribution of communities by the race, their class, and their gender, and it seeks to essentially advocate for equal access for everyone to live in a healthy environment. So what does that necessarily mean, right? If you are someone that lives near a toxic air pollution sites, such as like living near industries or freeways or the trains, like these are all environmental pollutants. And also asking yourself, do you have access to clean water? Do you have access to clean soil? So the environmental justice movement is a very rich movement that has started from grassroots activism. It starts specifically into like Black and Indigenous activists and revolutionaries that essentially were being poisoned in their lands in the United States. And it really seeks to kind of highlight that, you know, the environment itself has a lot of issues because of the policies and practices that were implemented over time. So when we talk about environmental justice, we're also advocating for those who are in prison currently in the prison, immigration, and military industrial complex, right? Not just communities that live next to us and our neighbors, but people who are also currently being oppressed by these systems. And so asking ourselves, like, what does it mean to go beyond our community? What does it mean to go beyond the area that we live in? And a lot of the times in my work, especially within veganism, I get this common statement of the environment can't be racist. And so this statement, they're very problematic to me, because I think what I love to do is rephrasing this to say it is in fact not racist, the environment. However, the people and the policies that were designed and implemented in communities are in fact racist. And so when we look into environmental racism and people kind of get confused or a little bit scared about what's happening, you have to look into the data and facts that has been out there, right? In the United States specifically, communities of color have the highest exposure rates to air pollution than their white non-Hispanic counterparts. So if you look into the distribution of states in the areas, and you see on the data port on the right side, you'll see the amount of hazardous and toxic facilities that are built throughout the United States. And as you can see the large cluster in the East Coast side, you'll see that states like New Jersey, New York, DC, these areas all have high density buildings and developments of these toxic facilities. The other thing that to kind of talk about the impacts of environmental racism and like environmental pollution is that these landfills, these sites, whether you're looking into the waste industry or the chemical industry, they are often located near communities of color. And a lot of data has shown that it's only about 1 to 3 miles a radius away from their communities, which necessarily doesn't mean that they're going to be protected. And lead poisoning disproportionately affects children of color, right? So when you look into urban areas, especially low income areas and affordable housing, many of the affordable housing units that are found in these units are known to have high levels of lead-based paint because it's cheaper to use. And as someone that grew up living in a house that did use lead-based paint, I also wonder, like, how that also contributed to my learning journey. And so there's a lot of data that's been out there that has presented how environmental factors have really had negative consequences. And as climate change disproportionately affects low-income communities of color, this increases their rate to the risk to obtaining a health-related disease. And so these extreme weather events can displace residents and even cause death. And the other thing we ask about is like water contamination, soil contamination plagues low-income areas of color so much, right? If you're looking into Los Angeles, you're looking into the Bay Area, you're looking into New York, you're looking to Brooklyn or Queens, or you're looking into New Jersey, like in Newark, like look into these data sets, and you'll find that many of these areas, especially where there's low income and high level population of Black, Indigenous, or brown folks or people of color, you will see that there's a largely injustice that is deeply embedded in these communities that has been happening for years, yet these communities still struggle to even advocate, to even get equitable justice in their community. So when we talk about environmental racism, I would hope that people really ask themselves, like, you know, give yourself some time to reflect of what this would mean to you, right? Environmental racism is the concept from the environmental justice movement that looks specifically into the policies and practices that discriminate against Black and Indigenous people of color and how they're designated based off their socioeconomic status and race. And a really popular example of this is redlining that happened in the United States. So when redlining was implemented in many areas in many states and predominantly Black and brown neighborhoods, they really made sure, and they worked with local city officials and banks to prevent any people who attended the war, veterans, to live nearby white communities. And so therefore, what ended up happening is that many of these people were rejected housing loans. And so they made them live nearby toxic facilities that were often, low income and less resources. And so over time, you see that the legacy of environmental racism still lives today, right? Like if you are someone that grew up low income, ask yourself, like, what are the toxic environments pollutants that you have in your area? Like, is it lack of access to water? Your soil is contaminated. Does the air quality, is it horrible for your lungs? Asking yourself this, because environmental racism, and specifically shout out to Hazel M. Johnson, who is the mother of environmental justice, she essentially proved why environmental racism is real and how it affected her community and children. So there's a lot of great story and work on her. So please make sure to check her out. But as an educator, I really talk a lot about these intersections, right? I've worked a lot with organizations like Ecosha, for example, examining these issues and writing about these articles of why industrial agriculture is linked to environmental racism and what does that mean as a vegan, what we're advocating in this total liberation movement, right? So these are really great topics that I do encourage you to check out if you're really interested in learning more about it, but we're not going to be discussing all of it today. To kind of get started about agribusiness, right? Like a lot of us talk about this like large scale industrialized system, but let's kind of go back and think about like how agribusiness was made, right? It was coined back in 1957 by these two scholars, and they necessarily argue that privatizing the agriculture industry would create positive change rather than allowing the government to control the sector. What this essentially meant that if we're able to privatize the global food supply chain, this would mean that transnational corporations have a higher rate to be able to control the supply of the food, the soil, the seeds that we use, the chemicals that is used. And so therefore, agribusiness kind of defines production of through this economic growth, through the development of farm crops, including the production, processing, distribution, and transportation of food. While 70% of the world's food is provided by small-scale farmers in a lot of communities, food production in the US is dominated by agribusiness. And this is a huge issue because if you connect this back to veganism, right? Agribusiness is basically arguing that because it brings so much economic growth to the global North countries, especially the United States, that it has a positive contribution. It has one of the highest employment rates. However, if you look deeper into the data, just because they have more employees in that sector doesn't mean that they pay them equitably. And so there's still these major concerns about its environmental impact of why agriculture had to be so globalized and so privatized over time. And the legacy of this agribusiness has created this large scale injustice that we're seeing today. And modern commercialized forms of agriculture heavily rely on monoculture, which is the cultivation of a single crop in a large tract of land. And this essentially is focused on this yield, but also really heavily reliant on pesticides, insecticides that lead to soil degradation. And not only that, but the issue with agribusiness in these industries is the fact of how they have stolen seeds, especially native seeds from indigenous communities, and have really created the patented of seeds to ensure that farmers are held to the highest standard, quote unquote, to produce these monoculture products, and endlessly they enter this loan debt. And in our US agricultural system, in order for us to kind of shift to this regenerative mindset, return to localize, it's also important to address the idea of how agribusiness displaced many, is on indigenous land and has taken away the lands of many Black and indigenous and people of color farmers. It was a study that was noted that 97% of farmers in the United States are white. So when we look into this, we also have to kind of mirror it into factory farms and where they're being developed, right? And 77 billion land animals are slaughtered each year for the extension of factory farms is expanding globally every year. In my research and what I've been finding about veganism in the book I'm writing, interesting fact is that yes, the rate at which people are going vegan is increasing in the United States. However, the amount that animals are being slaughtered each year is increasing, and the development for these factory farms is in fact increasing. Kind of like if you were to say fossil fuels going to reduce their emissions when you see that there's new pipeline projects opening up. So there's a lot of controversy and the effects of what essentially must we advocate and how do we really critically analyze these systems. And kind of when people kind of come to me about like, what does industrial agriculture have to do with veganism? I say like, you know, it's the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. It has a negative impact on the environment, especially with methane release, and the contamination is essentially released into the environment. So in this global food supply chain, we're growing, producing, distributing all this food, which is really amazing. But we have to ask ourselves, like, is it really sustainable? Is it destroying biodiversity? And if we're truly trying to conserve bioconservation models, asking ourselves, like, who are the communities that you're working with and who is currently existing there? And so what's worse is that this business model, the agricultural industry, is heavily dependent on undocumented farm workers who are paid extreme low wages while working in extreme weather conditions, with produce sprayed with large amounts of pesticides. And at the same time, animals are facing high rates of abuse and being killed in these horrific industries. And in a lot of documentaries that have been out there about factory farm workers, they don't want to kill these animals, and they have said it, and it contributes to long-term PTSD for them. And so these people essentially are in this parasitic relationship with these industries because they have to survive. And undocumented workers who work in the slaughterhouses compared to the fruits and vegetables go through these repetitive motions for hours in a high food environment to kill these animals. And it has this long-term effect in their minds that allows them to really not be able to process this. And the reason a lot of these undocumented farmers can't talk back is the idea that these factory farms and these industrial agriculture systems also work with the immigration industrial complex. So when you're trying to survive in this industry and you're immigrating, you don't have access to papers, which is so messed up. You don't have access to economic or medical resources. So what else are you supposed to do? And so these are kind of like the realities of this industry that we have to realize that, yes, like our food does come from a global food supply chain. Of course, we shouldn't feel guilty as individuals, but we need to be addressing these intersections to understand where our food truly comes from. And for me, when I talk about environmental justice and veganism and industrial agriculture, right, fighting for a world where industrial agriculture no longer harms nearby communities or even living beings in this world, like animals and humans, where community species are no longer impacted by these toxic facilities, is the goal for a lot of what veganism is centered on. And when it comes to this water pollution, right, scientists have noted that animal waste is never properly treated in waste management practices, unlike human sewage systems that what you would say are more designed to be able to really save and conserve resources. And so animal waste runoff is a huge issue that is contaminating nearby water resources. And guess who gets to live there? Low-income people of color live there. And as you've seen in the documentary, I think it was called Cowspiracy, they kind of touch about this issue that communities that have formed these environmental injustices or health related issues like asthma, cancer, repetitive vertigo, these are kind of these long-term effects that are killing these people. And it was found in many cases in Wisconsin, like, that residents were being poisoned in their own water well systems, and they weren't able to really locate the issue until years later when they finally realized it was coming from the industrial agriculture sector. And it was found that, in North Carolina, which is the largest hog farm industry, that 10 billion of animal waste is produced each year. And so hog waste is waste from factory farms, has such negative impact for local communities, right? Like these toxic emissions, including sulfide and ammonia, were being released across the community, leading to headaches, fatigue, and decreased immune function. And so a lot of people ask, like, why does this really matter? Like, why should I even care? And in itself, veganism is political. It's not an apolitical movement. And there are prominent Black, Indigenous people of color vegans who have been making these interconnections for so long, right? These interconnections are not new. I've definitely cited all these resources that you can find more, but example like Afro Vegan Society, Food Empowerment Project, these are really organizations that are raising awareness on these intersections, and extending your acknowledgement and solidarity to these issues is not divisive, but rather encouraging for those to understand the justice of life itself, right? Education is important in framing historical events, injustices, and work, what makes us better vegan environmentalists, right? I always tell people that if our activism or if our education is rooted on what you would say provoking rather than to educating, at what time do you think it's going to be sustainable to keep that work? And we in this movement have become more fragmented over the years, yet a lot of people are joining these movements and trying to understand what their place is. And so what I always tell people is that if you're going to be practicing veganism and if you're going to be centering these intersections, that we are intersectional in these approach, right? And we talk about intersectionality, we want to give credit to Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term and who specifically talked about the intersections of how Black women were being affected through the legal institutional lens, and later has become very popularized, such as intersectional environmentalists. So I think it's super important that we kind of understand that, if we make these interconnections about veganism, that we also trying to give light, and we're not trying to take away the voices of others. We're rather trying to build these movements to become much more equitable and to have more people on our side to become advocates and to become fighters for total liberation. And so what can you do? There's so much resources out there that you can do advocating for the liberation for humans and animals. I like to read climate related books and vegan books that I'm actually reading myself. And there's so many BIPOC vegans who follow. I really have learned so much from these individuals that have talked so much about these issues extensively and have done so much hours of research dedication into the vegan movement. And I think it's really important that we amplify these individuals because they have done so much amazing work in this movement to do and sustain the work that we do today. But yeah, this is kind of a quick intro for a lot of people to kind of get started on this, but I kind of wanted to give a few minutes because I have to leave in 5 minutes, but I did want to have a Q&A for anyone that did want to ask a question, because I really believe that people should ask questions and should really learn from this. And yeah, but let me know if anyone does have any questions.
Okay, not from the crowd, but to kind of segue into the panel, you can hop off whenever you have to. I'm curious from our other guests who have joined early, if you can also speak to how you define racial justice. I guess it's a question directed at you, Isaiah. Oh no, wait, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. So racial justice for me, like in its origins from my like was learning it like 101, right? Like the very intro of like everyone deserves to be treated equitably. But I think racial justice comes from a lot of theories of Black liberation and Black revolutionaries that have been doing this work for so long. And I think that when we talk about racial justice, it's super important that we realize that and how veganism is interconnected, is that people are part of this community. And when we talk about people in this community, we have to recognize like what are the different intersections and the different levels of oppression that people face, right? As a person of color myself that is non-Black, non-Indigenous, like what are the ways that I uphold white supremacy? And I think this is kind of the reality that when we talk about racial justice, it's not just saying like, let's not be racist. It's saying that you're trying to have an active conversation to be anti-racist, to be anti-imperialist, and to be anti-capitalist. But what does that even mean, right, in doing this work, right? Then this requires a lot of long-term dialogue and solidarity work. In my terms of doing mutual aid work, something that I really realized is how much community and collective power creates change. And the reason why I make this statement that communities create change, not institutions. The only reason why institutions have created change is because it's come from the community members that enter themselves in those space. So for me, like when we talk into the intersections of racial and like social environmental justice, trying to think about the preservation of cultural, spiritual, and religious values, and how that has really sustained the planet and many cultures for eons, right? And I really think that like in trying to get racial justice into veganism spaces, it does take time for those who may not be able or not really aware of these things or have chosen to opt out of these injustices because they never had to experience them in their life. And so I think that's what I would really advocate for people to push forward for that sense.
Amazing. And I think we have one question from the chat. From a total liberationist perspective, how do you respond to people who say they only buy their meat from regenerative or humane farms?
This is a really good question. I think that we need to kind of, so I think, yes, I think it's, for me, I still say it's unethical. That's like my simple response. But I would say that, you know, the way that regenerative is being defined and the way that humane is being defined, I would first ask ourselves like who that is coming from. In many indigenous communities, and these are conversations that are constantly bringing up pitted about indigenous communities and veganism, there are indigenous vegans who exist, is that I think that when we talk about land, food, and seed sovereignty, and if we're truly trying to give autonomy to those who have access to food systems to be able to define it, that we really allow them to be able to define it as a collective, right? And that's when these different vegans that exist, like indigenous vegans, should be the ones that have those conversations, not me. But I think like when you're talking into more of like white-owned farmers being regenerative and trying to sell like humane meat, really challenging them and asking them like, why is it humane to eat something that comes from a live animal, and how is it regenerative if you are not, if you're quote unquote trying to be regenerative, like can animals and humans coexist without being able to be consumed? And there's a regenerative vegan farm, I believe, I forgot her name, but she used to have a meat farm and she used to sell what you call local meat. And so she turned into a vegan farm, and seeing her transformation is the fact of like when animals die on her farm due to old age or disease, she buries them, and I believe there's like a natural decomposition cycle that is added there. So I'd say that it's really like a debated topic right now, and I think like there's much more nuance to be added to this subject rather than to say like it's either yes or no, right? At the same time, I've talked to other indigenous communities, and from what they told me, how the way that they've been interacted with on others online is a form of indigenous erasure. And so just really making sure that like we need to really understand more about regenerative systems. Like I'm not a farmer, so therefore like I want to learn more about it. However, I do truly believe that animals and humans can coexist without the consumption of needed. And I've been in a lot of disagreements with people in this in the environmental movement. So I think like there needs to be active dialogue with this and just long-term discussion to really learn and to get people from that. But my main, I guess, things that I talk about from a total liberation perspective is looking at industrialized systems. Before I even look at a localized food system, I'm focusing on the industrialized agriculture system. Like how do my taxes are going to factory farms right now as we speak as a United States citizen. I'm more concerned to focus on this main pinpoint that I really want, that it's more accessible for me to talk to and to really get people on this side to join. I think that the regenerative conversation is very co-opted right now too, especially with white individuals stealing the language from indigenous communities. So definitely would look more into that.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us today. Really, really appreciate it. And enjoy the rest of your time in, you said Switzerland?
Yes, I'm actually in Scotland, but thank you so much,
Oh
everyone.
my God, Scotland, okay,
Yeah,
yes.
thank you. And yes, I would have loved to be in the panel with everyone else. They sound so amazing. But thank you so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna take a few minutes break before our next speakers. Isaiah spoke to the importance of like farm worker rights. So we're gonna be hearing from two representatives from the nonprofit, the Farmworker Project, who build awareness about immigration issues and who actually is behind supplying our veggies and the stuff that gets grown for us on a mass scale. So we'll be back soon.
not talking, sorry, about not including certain things in their curriculum. We're going to talk about academic freedom, our own experiences in the university system, and then also working in agriculture for a number of years. So Shania, if you want to go ahead and do your introduction, and then I'll do mine.
Yeah. So like I said, hi everyone, my name is Shania Hernandez. I am a first-gen college graduate. I'm originally from Porterville, California, occupying traditional foothill Yoka or Yadanchi Yoka land. I graduated with my Bachelor's of Arts in both Communication Studies and Comparative Ethnic Studies from Cal Poly SLO. Growing up in Porterville, California, it is at the center of some of the most agriculturally productive regions in the country. So I've been surrounded by farm workers and agriculture my entire life. So it has a very personal investment for me. And that's a little about why I am so invested in this work and why I decided to take it with me in my experiences at Cal Poly. Of course, going to Cal Poly was a huge culture shock. I originally only went in under the communication studies department. And in those spaces, I just felt like I could not resonate with the scholarship or peers or other professors and such. And I just felt like something was missing, that sense of community and that sense of seeing myself being reflected in those spaces. And upon discussing and organizing with other students of color at Cal Poly, I found my way into the ethnic studies department, which was completely revolutionary for me. I was being introduced to new concepts and things that finally gave me the tools I needed to articulate not only the experiences that I had prior to coming to Cal Poly, but also the things that I was experiencing on this campus at a predominantly white institution. And so with that knowledge, I decided to tie in my hometown roots of being invested in agriculture and farm labor. And I tied that into my senior project, which was laying out a blueprint for an outreach program for students high school students in the Central Valley who need resources to better prepare them for higher education, whether that's getting workshops on how to fill out FAFSA correctly, or just learning more about agriculture as that type of mobility, occupational and educational mobility was not there in these communities whose lives revolve around agriculture. So that's what brought me to this, and that's how I found the Farmworker project.
Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Sean. My pronouns are he, him. I started studying agriculture at Cal Poly from the get-go, and it's a polytechnic. So you start studying the major that you chose from the time that you started university. So I think from the get-go, we'll talk about this later in the presentation, but it was quite clear that I was sort of being fed an education that was leaving out the exploitation that was built on white supremacy in agriculture. And I'll give some examples that tie into how big industrial agriculture systems and big meat in specific played a huge part in the way that our academics that our curriculum was shaped. So we're going to get into academic freedom, but I studied agriculture. My undergrad was in winemaking and viticulture. And after I graduated, I spent 5.5 or 6 years working as a contracted winery worker all over the world. I've worked on wineries as a vineyard worker and cellar worker on 5 continents. And so I was able to, over those 5.5 years, look at myself and try to understand my privilege in that system. Sort of, and what I hope that we can get to at the end of this conversation is, yeah, I worked in wineries and yeah, I worked in cellar work, but the precarity and the struggle and the suffering that's attached to the work that I was doing is not the same as it is for farm workers. And so that led me to the point where I ended up starting a workshop business in San Francisco and the San Francisco Bay Area, teaching workshops on chocolate making and fermentation and all sorts of classes that tied or actually forced people to have the conversations about where our food comes and where our food comes from and what the impact is through actually producing those foods. And when COVID happened, that workshop business sort of shut down, and I'm currently doing my master's in the anthropology of food at University of London, SOAS. I'm working on a PhD proposal that explores Amazon's impact on global labor markets in the food system. And in studying anthropology and getting back to the social sciences, what that was about for me was understanding my role as a white male, as an activist, which starts at listening, and understanding that when I go into a farm space, not only as an agricultural worker, but as an activist, it's more likely that, you know, I have to understand the violence that's carried with the white male body as it walks into a farm space, because it's more likely that I look like a cop or an ICE agent or, you know, some other oppressive structure than it is that I'm a farm worker or an activist. So something that we get into on our Instagram page is that like helping is not always helping. And so you have to understand your position and proximity to the field to be able to, you know, do that work. And that starts at listening. And excuse me. Yeah, so we're going to move into the next part. Go ahead, Shania. So we're going to show a video here quickly that it kind of sums up the work we do, we feel. So we're elevating voices of farm workers, and what we're trying to show is that, like, yeah, so a lot of the work that we do is through social media activism and taking voices and elevating them. And so what we see here is this video that took place on a farm in Santa Maria, California, and these workers videotape the entirety of this interaction between their mayordomo or their supervisor and when they were asking for higher wages. So these workers work on piece rate, which piece rate is the sort of work where you're judged or paid based on the amount of berries that you pick during a certain period of time. So that can be what, you know, what the ownership would call, you know, a good wage for a period of time. But when the strawberries start to go, there's not as many ripe strawberries, then that wage isn't, you know, it's not really a fair wage anymore. So these workers were fighting for that wage. And this video ended up getting shared, you know, 5-6 million times on our page between Instagram and TikTok. And what it did was it essentially publicly shamed the company into you know, shifting that wage. So what we're kind of looking at here is like social media as a form of collective bargaining and worker power. And then what the implications of that are, or whether that's going to continue into the future, we don't really know. But when the power is in, you know, the hands of Facebook and Instagram to be able to monitor those platforms and change them, you know, it remains to be seen. But we're just going to show this really quickly. So Shania, go ahead and play that.
Are you able to hear the audio of this when I play?
Tiene derecho a mi cheque ahorita.
Ahorita te lo doy, pero los demás, por favor, pónganse a trabajar. Yo también.
Yeah, so that was just a quick introduction to the work. The farm ended up giving in to the demands of the farm workers, supported by two indigenous organizations, or one indigenous organization called MECOP in Oxnard in Ventura County that collectively bargained for them to get increased wages. So Shania, you can go ahead with this.
Yeah, so this is just a rough overview about how it is that we engage with various organizations. Something that's foundational to all of our work is initiating contact, right? We want to reach as many organizations, as many activists, as many individuals as possible to try and establish those relations and open up the opportunity for having these conversations. And of course, that also comes with understanding we need to nurture these relationships. It's not just a one-time exchange of information. We need to be in constant, continuous communication, establishing trust, establishing mutual investment and mutually beneficial relationships with one another. And that means that when we're working with other organizations, or when we're having conversations with families of farm workers or farm workers themselves, we do not approach with a like hierarchical understanding, like, oh, we're the powers that be and we just want to get information from you. No, we want to have that engagement where we want to hear from them what they need specifically. We are not here to speak on behalf of them, but to rather uplift the voices that are already there, expressing what it is that they need. And of course, that leads us to expanding our efforts and we do that through having conferences like this or through our social media outreach and just opening the floor for having those conversations and making those connections between spaces of academia, for example, and those spaces of mutual aid and on the ground efforts that are happening currently.
So yeah, with that mutual aid work in mind and sort of like understanding what we do is that, you know, we operate in the way that it's sort of like a get in where you fit in. Everybody who's on our team, which we have a couple other team members, is utilizing their skill set in the best way that they can to elevate voices, whether that be, you know, social media work, whether it be media skills, whether it be, you know, whatever it may be. And so we definitely defer to a lot of these other organizations that we work with when it comes to mutual aid or when it comes to, you know, going out into the communities on the ground. And so, you know, a couple of these organizations that you should give a follow that we aim to support are Ayudantes de la Tierra, which is in Salinas, California, North Bay Jobs with Justice, which is in Sonoma County, Líderes Campesinas, which is a women-led organization in Oxnard and Ventura County, and then Nuestra Comunidad 707, which is they work on fire prep because California, as many of you may know, is on fire about 6 months of the year. So really any money that most of the money that comes into us when we do sorts of you know, fundraisers, it goes out to these organizations so that they can continue to do the work. And we definitely defer to them because they have built trust in communities over time. And though they may not have the capacity to, you know, or the skill in social media, what we're doing is like, you know, hopefully we can provide them a platform to pass their messages on to us so that we can elevate them and pass them on to you. So you know that the sort of work that's being done and you can learn from their work as well. So yeah.
Sorry, I was muted. So what we really want to highlight here is that it's important to acknowledge the history of agriculture and its impact on those who have been the exploited workforce. It is important to acknowledge that industrialized agriculture has been and is a product of colonialism since this country's very inception, and that it necessitates an exploitable and vulnerable workforce. And the means by which this happens is through like violent legislation and even just like political rhetoric that continuously attempts to dehumanize, demonize, and describe these communities in a monolithic sense, rather than understanding that these are individuals with their own cultures, with their own experiences. And that's why we really want to center this discourse in addressing immigration, migration related to farm worker issues, and how that ties into our next slide, which is about shifting that dynamic to acknowledge like indigenous agricultural workers. This is a report from the California Institute of Rural Studies that just came out like a couple days ago or about a week ago. And we thought it was really imperative for various reasons. It increases the visibility of these issues related to agricultural laborers and workers. Oftentimes reports discuss these issues in a really passive manner. Oh, these and these issues are coinciding with farm towns and things like that, when in reality, the context of these issues is really imperative. And so what this study works to do is acknowledge like culture. There's various cultures and languages that are spoken, indigenous languages that are spoken in these communities. And that is necessary to acknowledge so that we can provide more culturally responsive assistance and things that are actually beneficial when we are working with these communities. And what it also does is when we see the shifts, like you said, from migrant laborer to indigenous agricultural worker, is we can now see that divorcing issues related to indigenous issues and from agriculture and farm labor issues, you can't separate them. They're not mutually exclusive, and rather they're very complexly intertwined. And so that allows us to have more enriching and impactful conversations about how it is these identities are constructed and for whom, and what impact does that have, and how does that influence now the way that we're talking about sustainability, the way we're talking about land back movements, the way that we're talking about feeding everyone, and the different methods and knowledges that we are looking towards to lead us in those more sustainable revolutionary futures when it comes to agriculture and feeding the world. So this also works to validate and nurture traditional knowledges, right? A lot of times in these academic spaces or political spaces, there's this striving for the elusive objectivity, when in reality that can be really violent without having the context of these issues. You can say, oh, there's lower academic performance of children in these areas, or there's these prominent health issues in these areas, but without acknowledging and contextualizing them by hearing the voices of those people who live these experiences, where then you're not acknowledging the structures that are in place that allow for these things to perpetuate. So that's why we want to make these connections from reports such as this and other academic works and things that are being done from various activists, and connect them to people who are learning more about these and want to find out ways that they can actually take action and be a part of the solution. So there's that.
Yeah, so Shania, I'm going to move through this one pretty quickly because I think we've got like 5 minutes. So a lot of what we do is try and provide context for the way that, farm workers are reported in the media versus the way that organizations like ours try and kind of give you a real reality of what's going on. So James Baldwin has what I think is a really important quote that just essentially says that the point of government is not to fix problems, it's to have seemed to have fixed them. And so what we saw this year was that there was an increased chatter about, the nature of the word essential and who's essential. Farm workers were also able to elevate, we saw social media videos of farm workers working in fires and smoke, which is, shocking to people in white collar society, but people who are working in blue collar society are always working within whatever it may be, fire, smoke. And so when the new Biden and Harris were put in office, they said that they were going to give debt relief to Black farmers. And then the New York Times posted this huge article that said, Black and Indigenous farmers are getting debt relief. And this was this huge presentation. And what ended up happening was that it was denied in a court. And now we're getting emails from Indigenous farmers who are saying to us, like, we're about to foreclose on our property. So can you put out a story? So, these sorts of actions by government, we believe, are meant to pacify the public. And what we're trying to do is say, when a story like this comes out, we're going to give you the reality of what's going on. Like, don't forget that this is still going on, that Black farmers are still having their land taken, that farm workers are still existing under this exploitative structure of farm work. Another thing that came out this year was the Farmworker Modernization Act, which allows farm workers with an uninterrupted 10 years in agriculture, they can get legal status. But like, what does that mean? Most farm workers try and get out of that work within 10 years. What does it do to a human body to work 10 years in farm work? And when you're looking at the constructs of citizenship and borders, farm workers, a growing majority of farm workers in California are Indigenous. So what are we really looking at here? When we're saying we will provide you with citizenship if you work X number of years in this space, when these borders were constructed to keep you out and now you're working the land continuously. So yeah, we can move on from that, Shania.
Did you want me to go back?
Maybe, Shania, do you have any like closing things that you want to get through? Because I think we're close to done. So maybe go to the points where you're like, yeah, I really want to say that.
Yeah, essentially just to kind of crash course this, why is this relevant to talk about in these spaces? Well, there's various health issues that impact farm worker communities in those towns, as well as environmental issues that are significant in those towns as well. And so at the intersection of both of these are these discussions about what it means to be sustainable, what it means to what it means to be sustainable and how it is that we plan to feed the future. And so these are all things that need to be at the center of our discussions about sustainability and ethical consumption and ethical growing and things like that. So that is why we believe it is relevant here.
Yeah, maybe skip that and just go to the end, because really quick here, we were going to go into this, but a lot of what we do is the work understanding how farm workers, an exploited workforce is started. And so the UN COP26 is going on right now, and there's all the UN Food System Summit happened at the end of September. And there was a lot of pushback because Indigenous voices weren't included, and Indigenous voices aren't included in COP26. And so I actually gave this presentation at the UN Foods, with some fellows from some program that the UN had put on. What I was saying was I gave a history of how exploited workforces are created. And so when the Kyoto Protocol was signed, what it did was it gave corporations these contracts to go in and work on green development and sustainable development. And what that did was it ended up putting a ton of wind farms in southern Oaxaca. And that displaced farmers, it displaced individuals, and it created conflict in the area where these, green capitalism was said to be, they wanted it to flourish, but they put it on indigenous lands. And so that facilitated a migration of individuals from this isthmus, which is called the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And recently, in 2019, 15 indigenous people who were activists and pushing back against these wind developments were killed. And it was kind of not said who killed them. It might have been associated with local government, but one of the main members of our team, Amadeo, is actually from the community into the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. And so it's like you meet people and you try to understand their stories, and we try and elevate those stories. But this is how workforces are created. Nothing is nothing is disconnected. So when we talk about Indigenous voices being included in COP26 and in being included in the UN Food System Summit, it's not some like we should just include Indigenous voices. It's like these are the realities that Indigenous people face when corporations that don't have any individuals within their structures that know the realities of what it's like to be colonized. That's what we're trying to get at in a lot of the work that we do. You can move on from that. And maybe we'll skip that video, but that video back there, we'll share it with you later. When I was at Cal Poly, my freshman year in 2009, there was supposed to be a panel where Michael Pollan was going to talk about, alternatives to, feedlot type agriculture, massive agriculture systems. And what ended up happening was Harris Ranch, which is a meat producer in California, formerly the biggest meat producer in California, pulled a $500,000 donation to the school. And then Michael Pollan's speech ended up being a panel. And so that was my introduction to agriculture, was at Cal Poly, was understanding that we weren't getting the full story. And it goes way beyond that. And maybe we can talk about that when we have a chat later with Shania and myself. And then Shania, can you go back to the last slide? There was also an issues in animal agriculture class that was going on, and the professor was forced out. So that's another article I can send you. And then the last thing that we just wanted to say before we go is, we're talking about action items, and the visibility thing is really important. Farm workers are able to use that as collective bargaining. And to fight for, higher wages. Social media is actually doing that, which is really interesting and cool. Yeah, you can read that if you'd like. And then we've just finished designing a website called faircampo.com, which is, what it is it's a glass door for farm workers. And it's going to have Spanish language, English, Mixtec, and Zapotec. And it will give farm workers the ability to communicate anonymously in the same way that most people that work in the tech industry or whatever industry it may be have the ability to do through Glassdoor.com or Yelp or TripAdvisor. It's just bringing transparency. So we're working with student-led organizations across the country to sort of facilitate that movement, and we're just like, the website is almost done. So Shania, if you want to wrap, and then maybe we can move to the panel. Sorry for going over time. Appreciate everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end. Honestly, I just want to thank you all for giving us the opportunity to be here and share this really essential information when we have these conversations about food and the environment and how it is that we strive for, efforts to improve our future in a more sustainable manner. So thank you all. We hope you enjoyed. Sorry also for going over time, but thank you.
No worries. Thank you so much. Okay. So moving into the panel, I'm going to go into gallery mode. If everyone, this is going to be kind of a roundtable, don't mind me. I'll just insert some questions to facilitate the conversation. Thank you guys so much for your presentation. I'm really excited to see some of the things that you couldn't get to, I'm sure are going to come up in the conversation as well. And so just to begin, I don't think people are in the same order that I'm seeing them. But okay, we can start with whoever is here right now. Oh, Christopher, do you want to introduce yourself and then we can go around, or popcorn, however you want to do it?
Hey, absolutely, I will introduce myself. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, super. I'm Christopher Sebastian, and I am a technical writer and a journalist and digital researcher. I have been working in vegan advocacy and animal rights advocacy for about the past 7 or 8 years. And I specifically look at the intersections of food, politics, media, and pop culture. And that's me. We can move on and call on the next person.
Let's go Jaya, if I'm pronouncing your name right. Jaya?
Jaya, yes, thank you,
Jaya,
Claire.
okay.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jaya Bumithra. I am a longtime social justice activist. I have spent the last 10 years working in the nonprofit farmed animal protection sector, but recently pivoted this past year to launching my own consultancy. We'll probably get into that a little bit more in the question and answer, but now I'm doing leadership and management coaching for individuals and organizations, but always, always, always with the social activist lens and with an equity bent. And so I'm really pleased to be here and spend time with all of you. Thank you for sharing space with me.
And then let's go Brielle.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brielle, and I am the program director at Encompass Movement. And so Encompass is working to create a more equitable animal protection movement and specifically focusing on racial equity. So I'm really looking forward to diving into these topics with all of these amazing activists.
Awesome. And then whoever has not gone yet.
Hi, I haven't gone yet.
Or-
Can you all hear me okay? Okay, cool. So hi, my name is Ryuji, and I work primarily in animal rights and in specifically educational activism. And what I try to do is I try to take some of the ideas that we have in the animal rights movement and package them in a way that's palatable and engaging and entertaining and interesting to kind of like a wider public. And the main way that I do that is through making videos. I currently work as a video editor / content creator in an animal rights organization, as well as make some of my own content on personal platforms as well.
Okay, I think we've moved through the introductions, so I'm just gonna ask one question to get the conversation going. And that's, how do you define food justice? Anyone who wants to unmute can.
I can go ahead and begin. Food justice, I think, has been really well covered by our previous panelists. So thank you so much for those excellent presentations, because they were very thorough. They were incredibly moving and very much aligned with my own value system. So I'm really pleased to be in this company today. But I also think of food justice in terms of being considerate of every single stakeholder in the food system. So that includes obviously farm workers, that includes the consumers, that includes the businesses, suppliers, growers, government, and certainly has accountability here. But I also like to think about who is working on the activist side. So this is something that has been like a growing interest area for me, is coming from the nonprofit sector and working in activist spaces. Food justice also very much matters for the activists who are advocating for food justice.
Okay, then we can go on to the next question. We can do, yeah, where do you see overlaps in the fight for racial justice and for how we've previously defined food justice? And what are your approaches?
Yeah, happy to hop in here. I think the connection between food justice and racial justice is so inextricably linked, because when we think about who's most impacted by animal agriculture and factory farming, it is Black, Indigenous communities of color, or Black, Indigenous people of the global majority. And so it's crucial that we really uplift that point. And if we're not taking a look at that and uplifting the voices and leadership of communities of color, we're really missing the mark on this deep connection between food justice and racial justice. And so when you talk about what are the approaches with Encompass, one, we're working with white-led organizations to support them embodying values, policies, practices of racial equity, but then also working to uplift and empower Black, Indigenous people of the global majority to connect with one another, uplift our brilliance in the movement, because we've been here doing this work. Veganism has its roots in the global South. And so let's make sure that we're uplifting our leadership to address these issues that impact us most.
And then Christopher, I see your hand is raised. You can unmute.
Hey, yes, thank you so much. One of the things, although like my work primarily focuses on like animals as victims of like social injustice, one of the things that I think that oftentimes that is overlooked in animal justice circles is the ways in which like racial justice and food justice overlap with this issue. And these are like adjacent and overlapping issues at the same time. And there is an enormous historical context to like legislative policy making that like, you know, that has led to the place that we are. And a lot of people minimize the role of like our legislative processes and like, you know, and like, and the media forces that influence the food choices that we make and the way the food is presented to us in different racial categories and different racially segregated communities. And in the United States, in particular, where I'm from, although I'm right now in London and it's like 8 o'clock at night for me. But yeah, like, you know, like an amazing book that I just read is called, I believe, Supersizing America, which is not to be confused with the documentary by Morgan Spurlock, which was Supersize Me. But like it talks about like specific policy decisions that were made during the 1960s that had created food swamps in urban communities that were densely populated by Black and brown people. And like, you know, and there's also another amazing book that I read called Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs. And I have referenced that book before in classes that I've taught at Columbia and at Cornell. And along with like other lectures that I've done. And it's a brilliant, brilliant book because one of the things that I hear people talking about like oftentimes in animal justice communities is like the distribution of the types of animals that like are consumed by different groups of people. And of course, in the United States, like Black and brown people disproportionately consume more chicken historically than our white counterparts. Why is that? And a lot of that has to do with the economics of slavery and who was considered an actual farm animal and who was not considered a farm animal. And as it turns out, chickens were often not counted among farm animal populations. And as a result, African people who were enslaved disproportionately consumed more chicken because it was not considered a quote proper meat. And when we look at the number of chicken lives that are lost in like farm animal agriculture, well, not lost, but that are specifically taken, it's so high, it's astronomically high. And what we have now are like people making what they feel like are more educated food choices about like what are healthy proteins or eating lower on the food chain to minimize their climate impact. More and more people are eating chicken. And so like these are, again, like, you know, they're just being able to have a conversation about legislative forces, social, economic, cultural forces that have created the food choices that we make in different communities is super, super important. And that is, for me, one of the things that I see as being really, really important to address in food justice, racial justice, and in animal justice.
Amazing. I think this fits in really well with the next question about speciesism and where you think that word fits into this conversation, if it's a word you use personally. Any thoughts?
Okay.
Also, if there's added context needed, in a lot of vegan spaces, particularly like massive Facebook groups online, there's like it's a daunting amount of people who talk about speciesism, and that's where the conversation ends. And I personally, that word gives me pause for several reasons, but I don't know what the climate is around that word for you guys. Do you use it? Is there any?
Okay.
I raised my hand again, but I'm not sure.
I'm happy to jump in, but I think Christopher, oh, sorry, I think you raised your hand. So yeah, I think you should go ahead.
I did raise my hand. First of all, I'm curious what about the word gives you pause in using it and why?
I think in unpacking, I've been vegan for 7 years now. And even saying to people, depending on where I am, like I'm vegan, there's a level of, I don't know, I feel like in recognizing animal rights and the sanctity of all life, using words that equate to like speciesism, that vernacular taken from all of the bad isms, when you apply it to animals, I feel like it overshadows in some ways conversations that are explicitly left out of animal rights spaces. But both, again, are extremely important causes. But how do we use language in these spaces and why is that important?
Before I answer, I don't want to like take up all of the talking space. I see that Jaya also has her hand raised, so I want her to go first before I give my response.
Thanks, Christopher. And Ryuji, did you also have something? Because I think you had your hand up too before mine even.
Yeah, but no, but you go ahead first.
You go first, I'll go
Totally
second,
fine.
and then Christopher can go third.
Okay, so I guess like I think the first thing that you asked is how do you define speciesism? And I guess the way that I understand it is that we value different animal lives differently on the basis of their species. So the biggest example of that, the most notable maybe, is the difference between humans and all other animals, where as humans we are also animals, and yet we almost see ourselves as a completely different type of organism. Like we don't even see ourselves as animals really, which is why we often use the phrase humans and animals, as if humans are not included in that group. That can serve as a shorthand that's useful in communicating, but I think it reflects something about the way that we see humans in relationship to other animals. But then within animals, we also see different animals differently. So for example, dogs, we see them as companion animals. People describe them as family members. While for other animals, like farm animals, for example, we almost perceive them as they are here essentially to feed us. Our attitude, how we see them, how we feel about them is completely different. And the way that we kind of like put those animals into different categories, one way we do it is in a logical way where we say, well, these, this animal's dogs have been companions to humans for a long time. We have farmed chickens for a long time, but it's also about how we feel about them. And, a lot of people, at least in the countries that I've grown up in, will see cats and dogs, for example, and feel a certain way about them. We will feel like we love them, like they belong in our homes. But that feeling is just not there for other animals like chickens, cows, pigs, etc. And as to you asked whether or not we use that word, and you expressed how that word gives you pause, which I thought was very interesting. And I guess it kind of depends on the context, because words can be very, for me at least, words can be very useful in understanding and describing the world. So having that word speciesism in my head helps me understand the world a little bit better, and in some contexts help me explain it. But for example, for me, I spend a lot of time talking to general public. And in that case, it's not necessarily a word that I would use that often, just because it's not a word that people know typically. And sometimes it's kind of like I try to communicate concepts rather than words. So I will describe, for example, the concept of speciesism by asking, don't you think it's interesting that we see dogs a certain way, but then we see chickens a completely different way? So it's kind of like getting to that idea, but I might not necessarily use that word, but that's just for more a pragmatic reason of I don't feel like it might be effective in that particular moment. But that's not to say that there aren't certain contexts where it can be very useful to have that language. So yeah, that's my piece.
Thanks, Ryuji. So I'll hop in next and I'll get a little meta, which is that so I consider myself like a trained professional strategist. And so with that background and mindset, most of my work in the nonprofit farm animal sector has been around negotiations with big corporations over animal protection policies, and then corporate campaigns when they don't comply. And so that's sort of been my bread and vegan butter. But in that context, a lot of the times we are very considerate about what kind of words we're using and what we think have the most impact and what we think will be the most useful. As I've progressed in my career, and I also believe as I've decolonized myself, it's an ongoing practice, I have become a lot less concerned with what terminology I'm using that caters to white folks. I am very mindful of what words are my truth and what are also truthful to the reality of what is actually happening to animals. So I'm mindful of avoiding euphemisms. I'm avoiding of watering down language to make white folks more comfortable, whether they are the corporations that I've been in contact with, negotiating at the table with, or public members who are, doing outreach with at a tabling event. So in both areas. I worked in one nonprofit organization where I was censored from using the words imperialism and colonialism, which was really complicated and difficult because of the fact that I was overseeing a global corporate outreach team, and we were, had our hands in many different countries. I ultimately came to the conclusion that there is no way to do to have a decolonized approach when working with a white-led organization. And I have shifted in terms of my own values about that work that I did. I'm still very proud of the work that we accomplished as a team. It was really incredible, but I probably wouldn't do it again in the exact same format that I did at that time. And that is, again, because I think that there was so much censorship over the language, and that has been an ongoing theme in many of my workplaces. So I think I was a little cryptic in the beginning, but I want to just sort of state here where I think my role on this panel may be, which is that when I'm talking about stakeholders, we were talking about, whether or not we're enacting oppressive, I think Sean mentioned this in his presentation, but, whether or not we're enacting oppressive systems in the organizations that we're working in. We are activists in activist organizations, and then we are trying to make change on the outside. But very often on the inside, these oppressive systems are very much rooted in place, and it makes it impossible for us to liberate these populations that we want to liberate, or work alongside these populations as they liberate themselves, because of course we should be in a solidarity sort of space, and a solidarity type of movement, as opposed to a white saviorism kind of approach. But going back to the the words. Yes, words matter. Language always matters. We all know that. But the summary of what I want to share is that speciesism itself doesn't irk me in any way. I feel comfortable with it. I don't use it a lot. It doesn't come up a lot in my speech, but not because I feel uncomfortable with it or don't want to use it. But there's a community agreement that many of you may be familiar with called Say the Thing, which is like when you're in a conversation, you don't need to walk all around a subject to make the folks comfortable. And that's the space I'm in now. It's I at this stage of my career and my decolonial approach, I say what I think needs to be said, and the other person will hopefully hear it. If not in that moment itself, maybe they'll hold on to it for some time, and at some point it'll resonate with them and start to plant a seed in them. So I like to just say the words that need to be said.
You couldn't see me clapping, but I was clapping down here. I'm gonna address the question we got in the comments, which is also something I want to bring up in a bit regarding zoonotic diseases, I believe. So at a time when the entire world has been aligned in one common issue, COVID, feels that our movement has largely overlooked the extremely valuable opportunity connecting the direct link of this pandemic and 75% of all others to the use and to our abuse and consumption of animals. Why do you think this is, and what might some of you be doing to address this, as it largely affects the most marginalized in our world? So this possibly once in a lifetime opportunity is not wasted. Thank you, Donald. Yes, Christopher.
Sorry, it took a moment to unmute myself. This is a really challenging question, and it's a really necessary question to ask. I don't really have a good answer for it, because I will tell you what has consumed the past 18 or more months of my life. Working in journalism, one of the things that I focus on is misinformation, and misinformation campaigning, which can include everything from disinformation, which is intentional, or propaganda, which is also intentional, or just incidentally introduced misinformation, through, say, satire or things like that into public spaces. And there has been an onslaught of it, especially in political discourse, since 2016, when most people were kind of becoming familiar with the terminology around it. And an acceleration of it since the beginning of the pandemic, as we see people diving into absolute rabbit holes of conspiracy theories and extremism and extremist thinking. And because it has taken up so much time to correct misinformation, to save people in the moment, it feels almost like doing triage. I have seen some animal rights organizations and food justice organizations actually taking on the work of addressing COVID and the causes of pandemics, which are primarily driven by zoonotic diseases. But not everyone has done that in a responsible way. Sometimes it feels like they are exploiting the crisis rather than raising awareness of the causes of the crisis, which has done everything from promoting more disinformation to promoting all kinds of bigotry and or reinforcing bigotry, including and especially xenophobia against Asian people. And so it is an absolute minefield to address the causes of zoonotic diseases while not fanning the flames of racism and bigotry against other humans. I applaud the organizations that have done that well. And the individuals and influencers and grassroots activists who have been doing that work. And I do think that there is a lot more to be done. And I do think that we're coming to a time where we have to reckon with the causes of zoonotic diseases, because as a scientist that I was just listening to on the news last week was saying, diseases and viruses don't form an orderly queue. It is quite possible to actually have multiple pandemics that are happening at the same time And it is entirely likely that we will be facing that in the future. I think that one of the things that we should be doing collectively is not just addressing the causes of the drivers of pandemics and zoonotic diseases, but also doing this in conjunction with the climate crisis, because as we know, we absolutely cannot continue to eat meat at the rate that we're doing and have a habitable planet in a very, very short amount of time. So these things should definitely be addressed in conjunction with one another. And I am aware that we're dealing with these things with a very limited amount of resources. So I think that it's important for us to partner with other environmental organizations or medical organizations that are doing this important work and seeing where we have commonality, so that we can take these things on in a more concerted and orchestrated way.
And I think, I don't know if it was Earthling Ed's campaign that used zoonotic, that is personally how I learned the word zoonotic disease from him and his campaign with Surge, I believe. But thank you so much, Christopher, for mentioning that last part about the proliferation of just a lot of xenophobia in the face of these, some, not to say all the Earthling Ed stuff, very good. And then independent of that, I've definitely seen things online that feed into this weird relationship between animals and anti-human racism, or I guess any way that people want to taxonomize living beings, they'll do it. So yeah, moving on to Mahali's question in the chat. Also a question for the Farmworker project. Oh, we have a big one before. We'll get to that in a second. Let's do the last one. I know that your focus is on farm workers within industrialized agriculture, but I was wondering if you have any experience or have been contacted by migrant workers regarding rights violations on smaller so-called family-owned farms.
I can take that question. Yeah, so I mean, while we do focus a lot on deconstructing industrialized agriculture systems, because of that sort of hands-off approach to agriculture where the suffering's on a wider scale. It doesn't mean that on small family-owned farms that there are not migrant workers that are being exploited. So for example, we had there's an agricultural land preserve in Marin County, California, and we had an organization there reach out that was trying to get us to focus on the way that these dairy farms that have been presented as these cheese makers, craft food spaces, where they have farm workers that are working in these conditions, and they're being provided housing, and but essentially what that means is that they're there 7 days a week, that there's no time off. And while these farms are being presented and glorifying agriculture as though it's some sort of conception of Eden that we're all supposed to believe in, that farm workers are still being exploited in those spaces. And so that's kind of the point of why we came up with the idea for Fair Campo, to institute that, and why we're trying to spread that, is because it's not, just because a small farm is a small farm doesn't mean that exploitation is not taking place. I mean, and further beyond that, we're not talking about exploitation. We're talking about structures of a way that farms operate in the United States. And we know that 96% of farm owners in the United States are white. So I don't have to say anything more than that statement right there. What does that look like on small family farms across the United States, where there's exploitation in every form on every size of the farm? I hope that was sufficient.
And I'm interested in the conversation about COVID and how COVID ran and currently is still facing farm workers at higher rates. If either Sean or Shania, you want to take that?
Yeah, I think, as we discussed before, there's this tendency to push issues relating to farm workers into the shadows, right? A lot of times this information is hard to access, especially given the fact that these studies from larger organizations and researchers oftentimes they don't acknowledge their proximity, they don't acknowledge their positionality in these larger power structures. So with that being said, sometimes information can be really off in terms of estimations of how things are impacting these communities. Me and Sean were discussing before about how certain studies will say, oh, well, in this location, there's currently 30% or 40% of farm workers who are doing this, but it could be upwards of 70. And it's like, okay, well, what does that do for us if we don't have an accurate understanding of these spaces, right? And that's another reason why we thought it was really important to include that report from the COVID-19 farm worker study on Indigenous agricultural laborers, because it is only from there, from engaging in these firsthand exchanges of like storytelling and testimonials, that we're able to gain access to this information. And in the beginning of COVID, when information was being shared about, oh, well, COVID is more prominent in Black and Brown communities, et cetera. And then this weird thing happened where people were like, oh, are they genetically more predisposed? And it was just a whole gross mess, when in reality, you're talking to these communities and you understand, like, given the vulnerable status of like documentation status and economic disadvantages, not having access to basic healthcare, and also not having access to adequate housing, which leads to multi-generational households where things spread a lot faster, or the fact that 80 to 90% of the people in their immediate family are working quote unquote essential roles where they have no choice but to go to work in the middle of a pandemic every day. So I hope that kind of addresses, that topic.
Shania, if you mind if I add just one little thing at the end as well, like everything there, and then it's access to farms. So access to farms for these organizations is like strictly policed. So for example, the Supreme Court put out, there was a huge battle that just went on where the United Farm Workers went onto a farm site and organized in that space. And then the Supreme Court just made it illegal for union organizers to access farms, which was when the grape strike happened, the Delano grape strike happened, that the UFW organized in 1975. One of the things was union organizers have access to farms, and that the Supreme Court just made that illegal. So it's like union organizers don't have access to farms to organize farm workers and give them access to unions. But it's also like a lot of the organizations that we work with don't even have access to go in and say, like, do you have farm workers? Do your farm workers have masks on their faces? Or, are you providing the sanitation services? Are you providing everything that they might need to be able to resist, the spread of COVID? So access to these farms is incredibly difficult for most of the organizations that we work with. And I think that is important, that and where we fix that, I don't know if that happens at the local level or the state level, but maybe somebody else has something to say on that.
And then if not, we have about 8 minutes of the panel left, and I have two big questions. I don't think I can get to them both. But one being, I'm so honored to be in this call and to have you guys join this conference today. You're doing such important work in organizing. And that being said, what do you think the role of the individual is when facing such heavily, I think Christopher spoke to the importance of recognizing a lot of this is policy as well. So these heavily systemic issues rooted in policy and a lot of implicit biases, et cetera, et cetera. What can one do, I guess? And anyone can unmute.
Yeah, I think when we talk about our individual role, the terms alignment and embodiment come up for me. And so are we being aligned with our values? Are we acting in alignment with what we say we really care about? And then are we embodying that? And so I love that Jaya brought up, we have to be super mindful of how we're reproducing these systems of oppression. And so I think about what are our relationships to one another? How are we, being really intentional about caring so much about those relationships that we're building and caring for those in a mutually beneficial, equitable way. I love that the Farm Worker Project talked about that's a really important part of your organizing. And so I think it's in our relationship building and building those from a space of care and embodying the values that we say that we are about and really being about it. And same with as individuals, the initiatives that we're creating, the organizations that we're running are the way that we're running those in alignment with what we're up to. And so I think if we look at, who's holding most power and decision making when it comes to our food system right now, with that being predominantly white-led, white supremacy and imperialism and colonialism has created the mess that we're in with our food system. And so we have to do things differently and start to shift the power back into the hands of the people that are most impacted by that, and make sure that when we're doing this work, we're also being mindful of, are we embodying these values of white supremacy culture? Are we really caring for one another in a mutually beneficial and equitable way?
And then anyone else can unmute, Shania or Jay.
Shania, did you want to go first or should I go? Okay, I'm gonna take this question and I'm gonna combine it with the other question that I see in the chat, because this will probably be my last comment in the interest of time. But there was a question also in the chat regarding plant-based alternatives popping up at fast food chains and accessibility and affordability. And I'm gonna take a different angle on that question, and that's why I'm going to combine it with this one. So the question that we have at hand is about individual advocacy and how that can play a role in what we're doing today. And then this other question is about, whether or not these plant-based alternatives are net positive or net negative for the movement for animal liberation, with consideration of how these big corporations also oppress marginalized communities. So speaking from my own personal experience, again, this is not something all of you will be able to see from the outside of the movement, but because I have worked in leadership roles in 4 of the most prominent farmed animal organizations from inside the movement, and a lot of my work has specifically been related to corporate campaigning, not only on animal protection and animal welfare policies, but also on getting vegan options into these big businesses. I have been a part of this team, if you will, although that's going to be a misnomer you'll see in a second, because a lot of the folks who are responsible in these organizations for these campaigns are the boys club, white, cisgender, hetero males, absolutely living every piece of the patriarchy. For many, many years, I was the only woman of color doing this type of work. And I have certainly been the thorn in everyone's side for my work, working alongside them, because I do try to dismantle systems of oppression while I am working in these spaces. As I said, it's not all external, it's happening inside these organizations. So I have mixed feelings about seeing the success of these plant-based alternatives. Obviously, from a point of view of accessibility and affordability, I'm very pleased about that. That's why I took on that work myself. But when you're thinking about who's responsible for this work, in addition, all of this boys club that I'm talking about, that has been responsible for really perpetuating gender equity issues, worker inequity issues. And I'm not only talking about farm workers, but again, that too, there has also been a lot of challenges with how they handle farm worker issues, but also labor issues inside these organizations. And then of course, have also been perpetuating racism. In fact, the reason I pivoted out of the nonprofit sector to build my own consultancy was because I couldn't stand to work for white folks in this space any longer, and determined that the most safe and effective way I could move forward as an activist of color was to build my own way of doing that. So that transitions into the next question, which is, what can you do as an individual activist? Well, what I learned is that you don't need anybody, and you don't need a platform of any kind of formalized venue. You can do this by yourself. I'm doing it by myself. And so I wanted to leave you with a couple of lessons that I wrote them down. So I hope you don't mind me reading from my phone for just a second, but these are a couple of lessons that I've learned in my trajectory over these last 10 years, and hopefully it will save you some time. So first, you don't need a platform. You can organize yourself. You can organize with your own community. I have shifted from, obviously corporate campaigns are incredibly important and still very valuable if you're approaching them in a certain manner. But I've also shifted to become really interested in local community-based efforts and mutual aid, which have just as much of an impact, if not more. And traditional campaign tactics work. The same kinds of campaign tactics, letter writing, petitioning, protests, these things have worked for decades over many, many different issues, and they will work now. They will work for you. Solidarity and consistency matter when doing corporate campaigns or any kind of campaign. Something I tried to do in my activism was combine animal activism and the effort for achieving farmed animal protection policies with efforts for farm workers. So I tried to connect with labor unions and see, hey, can we actually combine some of our policy asks? Are there things here that will benefit animals and benefit workers? And can we go in together with the same ask and kind of apply pressure from both sides? Will we get farther doing that? Also, if anybody else in the audience is a person of the global majority or of color, being othered your whole life will give you killer instincts in negotiations. You will be able to read the room. You will have emotional intelligence. This is an asset. It is not a detriment to you. I have been told to compartmentalize my identity and to not speak about my brownness in these spaces, and that I should just focus on the work and focus on the corporate outreach. Meanwhile, while everyone was eating up on my animal protection policies and thrilled with all of the great work I was doing, I was getting punished for being loud. I was being punished for being assertive. While these are the very tactics that made me effective in the boardroom. And so again, remember that you being othered and the life experience you have as a person who may be marginalized or oppressed in many, maybe not only just of color and race, but maybe you have a disability, maybe you have, maybe you're queer, whatever it may be, whatever has put you on the outskirts, these are your super strengths, these are your superpowers. As I said before, there's no way to do global work under white folks without it becoming colonial. Support Black and Brown-led organizations. They are the ones that are going to make the difference. Be vigilant about white spaces, build your own community. You have it in this room. All of you as a part of this conference today, you've got the power together, and just continue to build your relationships and stay in contact with each other, and keep holding that space. You are resilient people, you are powerful people. I want you to take that with you. That's all I'll say today. Thank you.
Yes, and then Shania, do you want to wrap up with your answer? Oh, and then, oh, I saw hands. Oh my goodness. And then Christopher.
Yeah, that was amazing. Oh my gosh, I don't even know how to follow up with that. That was great. As far as like individual efforts and things like that, we also found it really imperative to be knowledgeable about our positionality, as we've been discussing so far. And there was even a post that I created on our page about certain steps that we can take to like ethical community engagement, right? And one of the most imperative steps is acknowledging your proximity. What is your relation to the community that you are attempting to engage in mutual aid or allocate resources with? And how often do you engage with them? And what is your positionality in relation to the systems of oppression that are perpetuating violence against those community members? And it's really important, like we talked about before, to be mindful of that and the dangers of unchecked privileges in those various spaces. And also to nurture pre-existing relationships, like Jaya was saying, the relationships that you have and, with your own community already, that's important. That is organizing, that is your community that you can build with and uplift. And those aren't things that should be checked at the door. And that goes into our other issue of being reflexive, because ideas of objectivity are completely just bullshit, let's to be honest. And they need to be thrown out the door. The knowledges that you come to the table with are valid. Those are forms of data. That is research. That is all valuable work. A lot of times in spaces of higher education and academia, they tend to demonize or devalue all of these knowledges, all of these different epistemologies and methodologies, saying that it's not valuable, it's not professional enough, it's not objective enough, when in reality, we need to understand that how higher education has functioned in the United States is as white supremacist structures that are attempting to perpetuate the violence against these communities. So there, yeah, like I said, you're coming informed with all of your various social identities in your communities, and it is imperative to keep that at the forefront of all of these efforts. And like I said, changing your conception of what it means to have meaningful data, you having a conversation with community members, that's meaningful data, you observing cultural practices, that's meaningful data. All of these are valuable and meaningful, and don't let anyone try and tell you that it's not. And yeah, that's my little blurb. Just keep doing the work that we're doing, and be invested in your own personal interests. It's what'll benefit you most.
Amazing. And then Christopher, you had your hand up.
I did. I had my hand up because I was going to answer the other question about like the increase or the rise of like plant-based options in fast food places. Like just piggybacking on like what I was saying earlier about like the proliferation of like fast food places in urban environments. I am probably going to be like super unpopular in saying this, but nope. I do not think that they have been a net positive. And I have data to back that up, because data journalism teaches you that you need to be prepared to have these conversations that are going to make you very unpopular. Like I've written previously about like the reporting around like, you know, these new options and like, you know, and the harm that it does. Overall, they have not demonstrated to actually meaningfully decrease the demand for animal-based products in fast food establishments and in the broader grocery aisle as well. When you look at the OECD, Jaya is writing it in the comments right now. Capitalism is capitalism. Whether it is vegan capitalism, whether it is plant-based capitalism, whether it is Black capitalism, it is still capitalism, and it is built on the violent exploitation of minoritized individuals or disempowered individuals in our system. The reality is that, like, you know, the OECD is still going to, like, we're projected to increase our meat consumption over the next decade, which will not help us meet our climate goals. And like there is a decrease in the amount of milk that is being consumed, but you also have to look at other dairy products as well. And there's a net increase in like dairy products that are consumed by way of butter, by way of cheese. And so, like, you know, when we're looking at this objectively, people are adding to rather than taking away from their consumption. So we're looking at these plant-based products as, like, you know, as not a replacement, but as like a different type of food that we can eat. Just because we've introduced, and I use this analogy quite often, just because of the availability of gluten-free pasta doesn't mean that the amount of actual wheat pasta has decreased in our grocery store aisles. And the same is true for plant-based items. Burger King actually recently reported, I think in this year or last year, that with the introduction of the Impossible Whopper, what they're seeing is an increase of foot traffic in their stores, and not a decrease in like the regular beef Whoppers that they have been selling. So basically, we're just adding to the bottom lines of restaurants and, like, you know, and food manufacturers. And Brielle had commented, I think in the chat, that, like, you know what, one of the best things that we can do individually is consume as close as we are able to a whole foods plant-based diet. It is more affordable. It is much better environmentally. It is like arguably healthier. There are so many advantages to that. And although we cannot eliminate violence from the current food system that we've got entirely, we can absolutely minimize it. And I'm really, really grateful for all of the people who have said such brilliant things today, especially like Sean and Shania. Like, you know, I learned so much from your presentation, and I absolutely plan to be in touch with you after this. I'm starstruck with everyone involved. So thank you for letting me participate, and I'm done speaking now.
Thank you so much. And with respect to your time, wish this conversation could go on longer. Thank you so much for joining us today. And then for people who are watching this, I'll drop people's social media handles, the websites, the all of the above, I guess. I think that's all that exists, right? Or if you have anything else to plug, I'll put it on the Penn Veg pages so people can find you. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your days/nights.
Thank you, Claire. Every now and then I hear the echoes of like people in the background of the physical space that you're in. Could we see some of those people? Could you like turn the computer around, see some of these people that we've been in conversation with? See some of these faces.
Let me unplug.
Okay.
We are wrapping up. We have
Hi,
people.
everyone.
Conversation. Hello, hello.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi, guys.
Everybody.
Hi, thank you.